This video is going to be all about the 4.6 liter modular 2 valve from 1996 to 2004 in the Ford Mustang. This is going to be primarily focused on naturally aspired and all the parts. I'm going to walk you through every part as I added, what it did, how it performed, and what I would do differently. So let's dig in. It's going to be a long one, but it's going to be good. It produces about 330 rear wheel horsepower and 345 foot-pounds of torque at the rear wheels. That is all naturally aspired. The goal was to make a good daily driver that was reliable. If I didn't feel like working on it for a year or two, I could just drive it. I could hammer on it as much as I want without having to worry about wearing things out. And I feel I accomplished that. Obviously, you can put a supercharger on it, turbo or nitrous, and you'll get the horsepower up quick and easy. But that wasn't my goal. My goal was to keep it all naturally aspired and just pretty dang reliable. I also did not want to lose any bottom end torque. I wanted to retain the car's drivability. I'm also going to include a lot of tips and tricks as you're going through this process, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and just little tips and tricks, things I've collected from reading through the forums, trying it out myself, and seeing if it worked or not. This 1996 currently has about 151,000 miles on her. Like I mentioned, she is a GTS, a stripped down version, so she has roll-up windows and does not have power locks, doesn't have power seats, has these standard seats, and of course it has a manual transmission. Gotta have the manual transmission. I've also done some brake upgrades and suspension upgrades. It's a whole package for a daily driver. It's not a race car, it's just a good solid daily driver, but I'm going to cover all that in this video. It's going to be a long video. If you get bored, just pause, come back later if you're interested in this, because I'm going to cover a lot of stuff and it's going to give you a good head start to your 2-valve build. But now let me go ahead and drive her back home, pull in the garage, we'll pop the hood, and let's start digging into her. Alright, before we get started, I want to cover for the guys that don't know, there are 3 motors that came in the modular 2-valve Mustang from 1996 to 2004. The cylinder head port on the left is a NPI cylinder head, stands for non-performance improvement. That was used in the Mustang from 1996 to 1998. And the cylinder head port on the right is the performance improvement that was used from 1999 to 2004 in the Mustang. The 1996 to 1998 was a Romeo block and engine. In 1999, when they went to the performance improvement, they first started by using the Windsor block. And that's important to know. We'll talk about that later on. But around the year 2001, somewhere in that year, they converted the PI to a Romeo in the Mustang, and all the Mustangs started coming out with the Romeo. Now it's pretty much the same design. The PI has the same ports and cam profiles and specs, but you'll need to know that when you start working on them, you start swapping cylinder heads and stuff, because the Romeo heads and cams will not bolt on the Windsor, and the Windsor heads and cams will not bolt on the Romeo. However, if you have a NPI motor from 1996 to 1998, which is a Romeo, you can bolt on the Romeo PI heads, cam, and intake from 2001 to 2004 and get a nice bump in power. You're looking at a good 45 extra horsepower when you do that combo on the NPI motor by bolting on the PI heads, cam, and intake, which will put you about 15 more horsepower than if you just went out and bought the complete PI motor, because you will actually have a higher compression ratio than the PI motor. This is because the pistons on the NPI block have a shallower dish to them than the PI block, and the cylinder heads of the PI heads have a less CCs than the NPI head. So when you bolt the PI heads onto an NPI bottom end, you get a compression ratio of about 10.7. Yeah, so long story short, 3 motors, 1996 and 1998 NPI. the 1999 to around 2001 Windsor PI, and the 2001 to 2004 Romeo PI. The last time I had the car in the dyno was before I installed the ported and polished cylinder heads, and it made 314 rear-wheel horsepower and 323 foot-pounds of torque. I instantly left the dyno and I checked it on my G-Tech, and I calibrated my G-Tech to match these numbers so I can make changes down the road and I would see what my horsepower would be if I was on the dyno that day. Here's a picture of my G-Tech after I installed the ported and polished cylinder heads, which I got a maximum of 330 rear-wheel horsepower and 345 foot-pounds of torque. At this level, the car accelerates from 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, and that is on the street where it's not as tacky as you would be at the drag strip. So you can see my 60 foot is about 2 seconds. But it's pretty consistent. I can knock out 4.5 second runs on the street over and over again. If you have a G-Tech and you want to match the dyno, you have to change the vehicle weight. I had to get this vehicle weight up all the way to 4450 to match the dyno's horsepower of 314. You're going to see the Coyote 5.0 Mustang range anywhere from 4.7 to 4.30 to 60 on the internet. However, if you go on YouTube and look around, a lot of these Mustangs come with a built-in G-Tech on the dash, and most people are having a hard time in the street just getting into the 4s. A lot of people can get 5.0 pretty easy, but to dip down into the 4s is difficult. So a lot of these numbers, when you read on the internet, keep in mind these are professional drivers on a tacky drag strip. The numbers I'm giving you right here, and all the numbers through this whole video, are going to be on the street, real world. So this 1996, when it came out, the internet says it got like a 6.6 seconds, 0 to 60. And again, we all know that's a professional driver on a tacky drag strip. The 1999 with the PI heads right here, it claims 5.4 seconds. But then this other review right here says it's a 5.8 second. I'm going to say 5.8 seconds is more realistic with the new Edge from 1999 to 04 in stock form. That's about what I've seen them come at, 5.7, 5.8, 0 to 60. And like I mentioned, the Coyotes are somewhere in the mid-4 range. I'm going to break down this build a little bit further in the video, but I first want to give you a quick rundown of where she's at today. The rear end, she has Maximum Motorsports lower control arms, 373 rear ratio. The rear differential limited slip has been modified by adding an extra clutch plate on each side to give a more solid rear end when you're on the throttle. Has a Ford Racing aluminum drive shaft with Flowmaster mufflers, a Flowmaster catback, Mac off-road H pipe, which means there's no catalytic converter, and Mac long tube headers. The fuel pump is a Walbro 190 liter with a BBK adjustable fuel pressure regulator, 24-pound fuel injectors, underdrive pulleys, the piggyback style. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. A K&N cold air induction. That means really not cold air until you do some modifications, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the video. A C&L Plenium with a 75mm throttle body. Some Screamin' Demon ignition coils. Some fancy Ford Racing spark plug wires, 8mm. A 1996 NPI bottom end with some ported and polished PI heads that I purchased from Modular Head Shop. Stage 1 comp cams. And a ever so slight mild touch-up porting job on a stock Ford PI intake. Suspension mods are not too crazy on this car. I just put some Ford Racing springs in it. I can't remember which ones these were. I think they were C springs, but don't quote me on that. And just some KYB shocks. Of course, I already mentioned the lower control arms on the rear. Some polyurethane sway bar bushings. And then some BBK camber Casper plates. You're going to want this if you want to do a good performance alignment. You're going to need some way to set your camber and caster. The brake modifications are pretty mild. I thought about going to some Cobra brakes. That seems to be the thing to do on these cars, but after a little bit of research and seeing that the Cobra brakes come with a bigger rotor, which sounds good, but it's going to be heavier weight, heavier spinning weight and everything, I really just need the car to stop good. I don't need it to stop like a race car. So I went ahead and upgraded the front brake calipers to the PBR brake calipers that you find on the 99 to the 2004 Mustang GT. Before we get into each individual modification, the first tip that I'm going to have for you is you're going to need some way to scan your computer live data, look at field trims, engine temperature, air intake temperature, erase trouble codes, check trouble codes, and everything like that. And the cheapest way that I know to do that is this Torque app right here. You can get these, you can get this from the App Store, Google, or whatever. It's like $4.99. It's cheap. And then you'll need one of these, let's see, EML327. Just look for that on eBay or Amazon. Make sure it's a Bluetooth one. At least that's the one that I prefer. But this app will give you live data. So right here, you can see I have it set to show my long-term field trims down here, both left and right bank, short terms, the coolant temperature and the air intake temperature. You can set these pods to whatever you want. That's showing me the RPMs. Of course, the car's not running right now, so you're not going to see any information. Your mass airflow sensor. Again, you can set, see that's the empty one. I can put anything I want in here. It also will do your fault codes, and this thing just does a ton of stuff. So you're going to want some way to watch your live data as you're tuning this car in so you keep track of your field trims. And this is probably the cheapest way to do it. The Torque app and the ELM327 Bluetooth. Almost forgot about the short throw shifter. I picked this one up on eBay for like 50 bucks. But yeah. I've had this Mustang since 2010. The reason I'm making this video is because I'm about to add another Mustang to my collection, one of the newer 5.0 Coyotes, and I thought I would just go ahead and put this video together before I move on to the next. I'm going to be keeping this car. I'm not going to sell it. At this point, it's really not worth selling as much time as I have invested in it. My brother made a video on these two valve Mustangs some years back. I'll have a link in the description down at the bottom here, and you probably already seen it. He ended up wrecking that car not too long ago and picked up a 5.0 Mustang in 2014. But just to fill you guys in, he was able to get that car, when it was all said and done, when he was done with it, naturally expired, down to a 4.70 to 60. I think he said he got a 4.6 a couple times, but that's where he was at. The biggest difference between mine and his is I had the higher compression because I had the NPI bottom end with the PI heads, and his was a 2001 that just had the PI motor, but he did have the same camshafts, long two headers, very similar build. Here's a picture of my brother's 2014 5.0 Mustang parked beside mine in my garage. That was the day he brought it home. That's what he's currently driving around since he's wrecked his 2001 Mustang GT, the yellow one. The reason I'm primarily using 0 to 60 times on this video instead of like quarter-mile times is because, quite honestly, I don't really have much track experience with this car at all. I spend most of my weekends doing motocross. You'll notice this is a motocross channel for the most part. So on the weekends I'm at the track, the motocross track, not the drag strip. So that's why I chose to stick with 0 to 60 times. The G-Tech will do quarter-mile runs. However, to do a quarter-mile run, you're going to be breaking the law. You're going to have to go well over 100 miles per hour on a car like this. So I just stick to 0 to 60 times for now. Alright, let's talk about rear end gear ratios now. If your car still has a stock gear ratio on the rear end, you can find out what gear ratio you have by looking at the axle code here. Google that and you can figure out what rear end ratio you have. By the way, check this out. Mine says the body type GT2. I bet yours probably only says GT1 or just GT. That's because this is, like I mentioned, the stripped down version. It's a GTS. It did not come with power windows, power locks, power seats, and no ABS. If the rear end is stock too, there's also a tag on one of the bolts for the pumpkin cover on the rear end that will tell you the gear ratio that is in that rear end. But if your rear gears have been changed and you don't know what ratio is in it, there is one way to find out that's pretty easy. You jack the rear end of the car up in the air, get both wheels up in the air, get underneath the car, put a mark on the drive shaft and a mark on the tires. You want to spin the drive shaft, make sure both tires are spinning, your parking brake's not in or anything like that, and spin the drive shaft until the tires do exactly one full rotation. You want to count the drive shaft, how many spins it takes to get that rear end to do one full rotation. If you get 3.5 turns on the drive shaft before the rear wheels do one rotation, that you can safely say that's 355. If you get 3 3/4 of a turn, you can say that's 373. So that's just a quick and easy way to figure out what rear gears you currently have. If you decide to change out your rear gear ratios, you're going to have to calibrate your speedometer. On the T45 transmission, to my knowledge, in the earlier years, like on this car, there's a little plastic gear that goes on a piece that plugs into the transmission, and all I have to do is just change the colors of the gear, different colors for a different gear ratio, and that will dial in my speedometer. And all this stuff you can Google. I'm just kind of giving you some pointers here, but if you're doing this yourself, just take the time to Google it and look for this information so you can make sure you do a good job. On some of the newer ones, I believe it was 99 and newer, the speedometer, it can be calibrated through the ECU. You will need either a handheld tuner or a flash, or take it to a tuner, have them flash the correct speedometer gearing for it to match your rear end. But I do believe most of your handheld, like SCT tuners, have that option in there to correct your speedo. You're going to want to make sure your speedometer is correct if you change out the rear gear ratios. For you guys with the earlier years, like my 1996 here, where I can't really tune my speedometer to the PCM, it doesn't allow that type of program, and I have to do it through the little plastic gear on the transmission. They only sell the plastic gears up to 355 gear, and so like if you got 373 like I have, or 410, you're going to want to make further corrections. So what you do is you put the speedo gearing on the inside your transmission for 355, get you a little bit closer, and from there you're going to have to actually take the glass cover off your speedometer here, pull your needle up off the speedometer and put it back on in the right place to get your speedometer correct. So you're going to have to make changes at the needle at that point. It actually works, and it's actually pretty accurate. I've done it to mine and it seems to be fine going all the way up. It's pretty accurate, all the way well over 100 miles per hour. And I found the easiest way to do that is to pay attention, like drive down the interstate at 2,500 RPM, see how fast you're doing and how fast you should be doing at 2,500 RPMs. Come home, put the car up on jack stands where the back wheels are up in the air, put it in 5th gear, bring it to 2,500 RPMs with this glass removed on top of the speedo here, and then while it's at 2,500 RPMs, let's say it was reading 82 at 2,500, but you need it to read 85 or whatever, that's when you pull your speedometer needle off. Just gently slide it straight up and then move it to where you want it, to 85, and then press it back on. It's just a little pin that it slides onto. It slides right off and slides right back on, but that's how you do that. Here are the gear ratios that I suggest. In stock form, these cars can come with anywhere from 273 to 327 rear gearing. If you have 327, that's not too bad. It's okay. You're going to want, for performance, you're going to want at least 355, and for the street, anywhere from 355 to 410. I have personally driven these cars with all them gear ratios I just mentioned, so I generally know how they feel with all the different gear ratios. This one started out with 327, and then I went to the junkyard, pulled out some 355 out of a Ford Explorer, popped them in, ran them for quite a few years, and then probably about 2 or 3 years ago I went to 373 in this car. If you're going to change the gears, in my opinion, it's easiest and best just to use the Ford gears, the Ford racing gears. It will be easier in the end to get the pinion shimmed out and everything, but when you go to look that up on the internet, all the information is there and you'll see what I mean. Now, which gear ratio should you choose? Well, I have a rule of thumb that a car should never cruise for a significant amount of time any higher than half of its RPMs at redline. What I mean is, this car revs out to 6,000 RPMs in stock form. That's where the rev limiter or red line is in stock form, which tells me I shouldn't be cruising for a long time any higher than half that, which would be 3,000 RPMs. With 3 373 gearing, that is at 91 miles per hour. 91 miles per hour, I am at 3,000 RPMs. I'll tell you what, let's look at a gearing chart. I'll show you what I mean. On this website right here, which I will include a link in the description. There's going to be a lot of links in the description, but on this website right here, let's see, where is it? There it is, under calculators. I'm going to choose the 7K right here. Let me plug my information in. So I have the, I don't have the 3650, I got the T45, and then I'll plug in my tire size, 305, 35, 18, and right up here you'll choose your gear ratio, but we're just going to leave it at 327 for now. Remember I mentioned 3,000 RPMs is the highest RPM that you want to cruise at. So over here we have our gears, that being 5th gear, the bottom one there, and then 3,000 RPM, so that would be 104 miles per hour for 327. Now let me go ahead and put it on 355. 96 miles per hour. So let me put on 373, which that's what I have right now. 91 miles per hour. And if you go all the way to 410, it's pretty crazy, but there you go. 83 miles per hour at 3,000 RPMs. So yeah, play around this calculator a little bit and figure out what gear ratio you want. I'm going to suggest you're going to want anywhere from 355 to 410. And here's how I'm going to suggest this. 355 is, in my opinion, if you're doing primarily interstate. 75% or more of your driving is on the interstate, you're probably going to want 355. Trust me, I got 373. It's livable on the interstate, but my 355 was clearly more comfortable on the interstate than 373. If you're doing a good 50-50 interstate and city driving like I currently am doing, 373 is going to be money. It's comfortable enough on the interstate, yet it's got a good whole shot in the city. And if you never do the interstate, or at 25% of your driving or less is on the interstate, you might be okay with 410. It's definitely going to make the interstate a little tough at 410 though, because at 3,000 RPMs, you're going to be at 83 miles per hour. It's, yeah, but them are my suggestions. 373 is a good middle ground. 355 you're primarily on the interstate, and 410 if you don't care about the interstate at all. You can see here I changed my gears out on a driveway. That was when I was going from 327 to 355. I actually just picked the gears up at a junkyard from a Ford Explorer. You can see the gear set right there, and bolted them in, and it actually turned out great. Good used gears, and you can see right there I'm holding it. I already have the pinion already shimmed out to what it needs to be. But yeah, when I bought this car in 2010, it already had a couple mods on it. It already had the K&N cold air induction, although it had the stock little air divider right here that didn't really do a good job, but that's what it came with. It came with the stock Plenum, the NPI motor that was just stock. It came with these underdrive pulleys right here, a off-road H-pipe, still had stock headers on it, but it had an off-road H-pipe. That means it had no cats, and the Flowmaster catback system on it that's still on it today. Otherwise, she was bone stock, and I believe it did have a CAN tune in it, which means a tune that you just buy on the internet and they mail it to you or whatever. It's not actually a dyno tune, but it gets you close. Now, as I mentioned, these NPI motors aren't really the fastest. They're just really not. And even though the motor was very responsive with them few mods that it had a lot of hit, and it had the stock 327 gearing in it. It wasn't too bad. I mean, but honestly, I never did test a 0 to 60 at that time, but if I had to guess, remember stock, this was supposed to be like 6.6. I'm going to say that at that time, this car was like a 6.2, just based on how it felt and some of the other cars I raced on the road and how I ran up against them. I would say it was about a 6.2 at that time. But I knew right away what I was going to do when I bought the car. I knew that I was going to pull the heads, intake, and cams and convert it to the PI heads, intake, and cams. And that's what I did, pretty much within 2 months of owning the car. So definitely the first mods I would say is rear end gears. Get yourself at least a catback system. If you can get the off-road H-pipe, gets rid of the cats. I know that's pretty, it's pretty hard to get these days, but if you can do that, do that. You'll need some way to shut off the check engine lights if you don't like seeing them. If it doesn't bother you with them being there, it actually doesn't affect the tune if they're on. But you'll need some way to shut them off, or you can use, they used to sell MIL eliminators that would go on your back O2 sensors, and that would cure that if you remove the catalytic converters and go with a off-road H pipe. But you're gonna at least want a catback system. That's pretty standard when you first start, bolting on stuff. Throw in some rear end gears and a cold air intake, as they call it. That's pretty much that's the first steps. Oh, almost forgot. And a tune. You're going to want a tune. At least a can tune at this level. You don't really need a dyno when you're just doing simple bolt-ons like that. Just a can tune, because in stock form, at full throttle, your timing advancement is only about 18 or 19, maybe 20 tops. But with a can tune, they're going to bump that up to anywhere from 23 to 28, depending on your mods and what motor you have. So you're definitely going to need that. And another beauty about having a tune is it can raise your rev limiter. Stock rev limiter set at 6,000 RPMs. You're going to want to raise it up to at least 65, because once you start bolting on some stuff, and the motor's going to spin up higher, faster, and you're going to want to take it up to about 65. And the can tune, or a good tune, will allow you to do that. So rear gears, catback, maybe an off-road H pipe, cold air induction, and a tune. And for you auto guys, the tune will also allow them to firm up your shifts in your transmission and to choose your shift points. That's real important for you guys that are running the auto transmissions. Real quick, I'll pull this lid off and show you. This is just a K&N filter, or cold air induction as they call it. There's the filter. It's a really nice big filter. That's what you want. What I did is I cut a hole right here in the fender, and in the front I have a hole, and there's also a hole in the bottom. So it's getting all its air from this area right here instead of getting it from off the hot fan. That's why I built that box. You'll see some cold air intakes have a tube that turns in here, and people jam the filter in there. I have two complaints about that. First off, you can't get quite as big of a filter, and second off, you're adding another sharp bend in the tubing. I don't really want to add any more bends than what it already has to have, which is right there. So in my opinion, it's better to make an air box like this, or shield this off the best you can to get your air from the fender, and just use the filter right in here. But that's my opinion. If you build some type of box, I mean, you're going to need a lot of foam. That's what I use. I have foam sealing off everything. I use some of this. This is getting a little hard and dry right here, but let me get it back in there. There we go. I use some of this stuff here to seal it off. So, I'm just doing everything I can to make sure that it gets its air only from the fender and the front area and under the car, not from the radiator. And if you're watching your live data scanner, you'll know this temperature sensor right here will tell you how hot the air is going in the motor. So you'll know if you're sucking in hot air. And here's the worst part about sucking in hot air. It's not only that the air is hot, so the motor's not getting cool air, which it needs cool air to make its best power, but as the computer senses hotter air, it will pull out on timing, and it will start adding more fuel to help the motor survive in the hot temperature, and that means your horsepower will go down. So, and from what I heard, it doesn't start pulling timing until after 90 degrees air intake temperature. So you're going to want to keep it as low as you can get it. I understand sometimes it's hot out, maybe it's 95 degrees out, maybe, but hey, at that point it truly is getting that hot of air. But long story short, you don't want to be sucking in air off this radiator. You want to get it out there so that this temperature sensor doesn't read real hot temperatures and start pulling out ignition timing. You don't want that. I'll get to the long tube headers a little bit later in the video. I'm trying to do this step by step on where to start and as you grow with this build. So we'll talk about that further in the video. But at this level, another good add-on is underdrive pulleys. They claim underdrive pulleys frees up about 15 horsepower. I can't say exactly how much it frees up, but I know it definitely frees up power. Some years back, I had a 1993 Crown Victoria that had the NPI motor on it, and I did the same thing. I put the PI heads, cam, and intake on it. And then down the road, oh, by the way, that had an automatic transmission, so I am familiar with the automatic transmissions that come in these Fords, and I will be discussing that for you automatic guys a little bit further in the video. But So I bolted on the underdrive pulleys in that car, and it was definitely a nice boost. Not only did it seem to hit in harder when you smash the gas, but it revved out freer. So underdrive pulleys are a good thing, especially if you're going to be beating on your car a lot, like I do, because it's going to turn all your accessories slower. Your alternator is going to spin slower, your AC compressor is going to spin slower, your water pump is going to spin a little bit slower, and your power steering. So that's going to save wear and tear on that stuff when you're out there revving the car out real high everywhere you go. It's pretty much a necessity, really. I prefer the piggyback style ones. They're usually a little bit cheaper. The piggyback means that it takes your stock harmonic balancer, and after you bolt on the underdrive pulley, it's in here that the belt rides on, then the stock harmonic balancer will bolt on top of it, and no belt will ride on it at that point, but it just bolts on top of it so it can still do its job of absorbing the harmonic pulses that come off the crankshaft. I have heard people say that that's no good. You're going to wear out your crank bearings, you're going to wear out your main bearings or whatever. Man, I've hammered and hammered and hammered on this car and my Crown Victoria with this exact setup. Never had an issue with the bottom end. So I bounced off the rev limiter quite a bit. The rev limiter on this one is set at 67, and I have bounced off of it quite a bit and no problems. Now I will say I did purchase and try out, I forgot what brand it was, but one of the underdrive pulleys down here that has the harmonic balancer built in, so that you can have the underdrive pulleys, but at the same time you won't have to use a piggyback. That sucker weighed a lot. For them to set it up like that, it adds a lot of weight, and I swore I felt all that weight spinning. It's no different than adding like a heavier flywheel weight on your car. And you know, I'm searching for every last little ounce on this naturally inspired car, so I went ahead and just went right back to the piggyback, and I'm good with it. So yeah, stage one I would say would be underdrive pulleys, cold air intake, at least a cat back. If you can get an off-road H pipe, even the better, or maybe some high performance H pipe that has the cats in them. Rear gears and a tune, and that's going to get you on an NPI car. You know, like I said, it's going to get you about 6.2 seconds 0 to 60, maybe, depending on your traction. But for you guys with the 2001 to 2004 with the PI setup, that's going to get you somewhere. Remember, I pointed out on the internet, it showed the car doing anywhere from a 5.4 to a 5.8 earlier in the video. Let's just say the car really does 5.8 0 to 60 in stock form, because that's been my experience. Is 5.8, even as slow as 6 seconds, honestly. But let's just say 5.8 0 to 60. Okay, this stage one build that I just laid out here for you is going to get you guys with the NPI cars down to about 5.1 seconds to 5.5 seconds. It's going to be in that range, and it's going to really, a lot of that, the reason I gave it such a range, because at that point it's going to also play into how much traction you have, how hard you can drive the car out of the line from a dead stop, as well as the rear end gears that you choose. It's going to be, whoa, look at these birds. Yeah, it's going to be somewhere in that range. I'm going to say it's going to be somewhere in that range, 5.1 to 5.5 0 to 60. But at this point, it's time to step up the game. Now you're going to definitely have to make sure your transmission, clutch, and everything's good. For the manual guys, at that point, you're definitely going to want to have a short throw shifter. In the old days, they called this the 5.0 shifter, the 5.0 shifter, or whatever. You can't even find them anymore. They're so rare. But they sell these Chinese knockoffs on eBay for 50 or 60 bucks, and they're actually pretty dang good. So set it on the lowest settings to get this knob as low as you can get it, and put a nice short throw shifter. This can greatly save your transmission. I blew my first transmission using that stock shifter. The stock shifter sits way up here and has a rubber bushing in the middle, so you really can't feel what's going on in the transmission and so much, and you can't feel exactly where. And the beauty of this is, when you go from first gear to second gear, all you got to do is pull straight down. When you go from second to third at full throttle, just push straight up. It will go right to third on its own. When you go to fourth, just pull straight down. It'll go right to fourth. Now fifth, you will have to do the whole, but when you're racing, boom, 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 boom. Okay, so get a good aftermarket short throw shifter for you manual guys. The beauty of this too is because it's so short and low, it takes the leverage away from your hand and gives it to the transmission. So let's say you go to shift in the second gear, you didn't quite get it all the way in, and you went to go let the clutch out prematurely, it goes to kick out of gear, it's more likely to yank the shifter out of your hand, or even more importantly, going from second to third. You're going for third and you let the clutch out too soon before you got all the way in, it can push your hand back with a short throw shifter instead of breaking the transmission. With the stock shifter, it's so tall, it gives you so much leverage on the transmission that when it kicks back, your hand's just going to force right through it. You're going to snap your transmission. That's what happened to my first one. And for you automatic guys, remember I just mentioned that I did have a Crown Victoria that had the automatic transmission in it. That was a 4R70W transmission. You're going to want to do the J-Mod. There's websites, forums, just Google J-Mod for that transmission, and you'll find the instructions how to do it and where to order the parts. And it's a little bit of a technical job. You got to drop the valve body on the transmission and stuff, but it's not the end of the world. But you want to do that, even though they can stiffen up your shifts through the tune and also raise your shifting RPMs. They only can do so much. And for them to do that, they're actually having to raise the mainline pressure in the transmission. Anytime you raise the mainline pressure, you are actually robbing some horsepower because you're putting more load on the transmission's pump. So when you do the J-Mod, it opens up paths in the transmission, certain orifices and stuff, and allows the fluid to flow faster through it to complete your shifts quicker and firmer. And then you won't have to raise the mainline pressure so high in the tune to get the nice firm shift that you want, which means you'll free up some horsepower at the same time. You want them both combined. You want to have the J-Mod with the tune for you auto guys. That's where it's going to be at, and you will be chirping tires. Check out this video of my Crown Victoria. Yeah, it only did about 7 seconds, 0 to 60. It wasn't the fastest thing. I mean, it was a big car, you know, and all I did was just bolt on PI heads, cams, and intake on it. But check out this short video real quick, and you'll hear it. It chirps. And back to the manual guys for a minute. As soon as you burn out your OEM clutch, if it ain't already burnt out, you're going to want to put a heavy duty clutch in it at the minimum. Don't go crazy. You don't need some crazy stage 3 that has a real stiff clutch pedal. And you want to stay somewhere in the range of what your car can handle, because when you're doing real fast shifts and you're trying to drop that clutch real quick in the middle of shifts, if the clutch is too firm, it can put too much of a shock on your transmission, and you can start wearing things out in there. So just a standard heavy duty clutch is really all that's needed up to the level that I'm at right now at 330 horsepower. That's just good enough. Currently I just have some cheesy O'Reilly's heavy duty clutch in there, and honestly it's doing just fine. My first heavy duty clutch, I don't even know what brand it was. It came in the car when I bought it. I drove that thing around for 10 years in that clutch, and it was still actually gripping fine when I pulled it out. I only did it because I had the motor already out. But once you burn up the stock clutch, just put a good heavy duty in it. Don't go crazy. You don't need a stage 3, just a good heavy duty, and that's going to do it. Also, while you're in there, you'll probably need a flywheel, right? Stock flywheel gets old, starts getting little cracks in it and stuff. On this car, what I did is I put a lightweight steel flywheel. It's just about 2 pounds lighter than the stock flywheel, but it is a steel flywheel. It's not the aluminum one, so I was hoping to get maybe a little more life out of it because it is steel. But also, if you go too light, it can make them a little bit too hard to launch from a dead stop. That extra weight on the flywheel does help when you're dropping the clutch from a dead stop. So it doesn't hurt to go with just a lightweight steel one like I did if you have to replace the flywheel. I definitely didn't want to get a heavier flywheel than stock, and that was another reason why I chose a lightweight steel, to guarantee that some aftermarket steel flywheel wouldn't be a little bit heavier than my stock one that I was pulling out. The lightweight steel one was about 2 pounds lighter, I think maybe 3. Yeah, because if I remember correctly, the stock one was about 21 pounds and the lightweight steel was 17 or 18 pounds. Yeah. Okay, so I already covered stage 1 of the build. If you have the PI car, it's going to be, like I mentioned, cold air intake, under-drive pulleys, catback exhaust, preferably off-road H-pipe and a tune, as well as rear gears. And for you NPI guys, it's going to be pretty much the same thing. Now, stage 2 of this car's build probably will not apply to you PI guys, because this is stage 2 of this build was getting me up to the level that you guys are at. which is by adding some PI heads, cams, and intake. That's all I did. I went from what I just mentioned I had when I first bought the car. 2 months later, I bolted on some PI heads, cams, and intakes. Here's a video of it at the dyno. Check this out. This is the first set of PI heads that I added on the car in 2010. I later removed these for some ported and polished ones, but this was the first set. I did have to get them milled just a hair. You can see right there what they cut it to, and they cleaned them up, mainly because I had a nick on the surface. But they did a really good job, United Speed World here in Tampa. And yeah, that was my first set. Now, you're going to have to remember the number 58. I'll talk about that later. That's for your cam timing. When we go to do that, I'll show you an easy way to get them cams back in there, timed in correctly. And there's the finished product for that build. And this is just a little video showing how it ran after I left the dyno on that day. Sorry it's blurry, it's old video. On the dyno that day, started out at 259 rear wheel horsepower, and he worked it up to about 270. So it got me up to about 270 rear horsepower with just by putting on the PI heads, cams, and intake. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, that did give me a little bit of a compression bump over you guys that had the complete PI motor. On that day when I left there, it brought my 0 to 60 time down to 5.5 on that day, but I was still getting to know the car, didn't have the best traction, and I still only had 327 rear gears. I think I was able to crank it down to about a 5.3 with the 327 rear gears, and then I bumped it up to 355 rear gears, and that's when I started getting closer to the 5s. And but that's going to also take some more parts, and we're going to get into that next. Because at the time I was still using the stock Plenium, and that's a real restrictor, believe it or not, and the stock throttle body. But you know, wasn't too bad for that day. With the 327 gears, now that I look at it, it looks like I was able to get it down to a 5.28, which is pretty much a 5.3, but you can see my 60 foot is still suffering at a 2.2. That was the street tires that I was using back then. They were not the drag radials that I am currently using. Be sure to check what intake manifold your car currently has. You do not want the aftermarket Dorman intake on your car. You want a OEM PI intake from Ford. So look at the pictures. Here's a side-by-side. The left is the OEM Ford. The right is a Dorman. You want to get the Ford PI one with the aluminum crossover for the coolant tube. Obviously, they do have the older version with the plastic tube shown in this next picture right here. There it is. That one does work just fine if it's not leaking, but the aluminum ones are better. Ford PI intake, not the Dorman. It is worth horsepower, so make sure you definitely have the OEM Ford on there. If you're hammering on your car real good, you're going to definitely want to pick up some battle boxes from Wild Rides. You can just Google that for the SN95. You can bolt these in. They connect where your lower controller arms connect to your body. It'll keep it from eventually ripping the unibody down there if you're doing a lot of full throttle shifts and dead stop takeoffs. These are going to help save your body, so the car will be good for years to come. I bolted some in mine. They felt good. The instructions do say that you should have them welded, but it's not like mandatory, but you should. They suggest it. All I did was bolt mine on real secure, and it actually made the car feel a little bit more rigid and stiffer too, so it doesn't take long. 80 bucks, it's a good investment. This is my brother's 2001 Mustang GT with the 4.6 liter 2 valve engine. It's a very similar build to mine, except he does have the complete PI motor, which means he doesn't have the extra bump and compression you would get with the NPI PI setup. I have confirmed since making this video that he said he was able to get it down to a 4.60 to 60 pretty consistently, but with 410 gears, he said he would have to shift the third gear right before 60 miles per hour, and had he not had to shift the third gear right before it, he might have been able to get a 4.5 out of it. But it was a strong running car, and unfortunately it's been replaced because it was crashed. He replaced the yellow one with this 2014 Mustang GT with the 5.0 Coyote motor. It came with a few bolt-ons already on it, an off-road H-pipe, catback system, cold air induction, as well as a tune. It does have the stock 331 gear in it. On its first attempt, he was able to knock a 0 to 60 out in about 4.8 seconds. He hasn't practiced on it much, and I have a feeling he's going to get it down quite a bit quicker than that, even though it does still have the 331 rear gearing in it. Another quick tip, and this is pretty much a must at this point of the build, on your mass airflow sensor. See that screen right up on the front there? You want to pull that thing out of there. Wherever it's at on your intake track, find that screen and pull it out. The mass airflow sensor screen comes out usually pretty easy, but that is going to rob you about 10 horsepower if you leave that in there, and it gets worse as your horsepower levels go up. Let's talk about tunes for a second now. A tuner can do so much with the tune on your car. They can correct your speedo, they can raise your speed limiter, raise your rev limiter, and all these things. But right now I'm focusing mainly on just the tune as far as the horsepower part, how much power it makes. The first tune you get for the car, we'll call that a 93 tune, 93 octane tune. Mainly what that does is it bumps the ignition timing up. Stock they come around 19, 20, somewhere around that range at full throttle, your maximum overall timing advancement. And with a tune, they'll bump that up anywhere from 23 to 28. And also a 93 octane tune will make some corrections to the air-fuel ratio. Mainly at full throttle, since your part throttle air-fuel ratios are determined by the O2 sensors and the mass airflow sensor and the exhaust stream, trying its best to keep it at about 14.7. Once you have a 93 tune on your car, there are a lot of things that you can change without having to rush in and get another tune. Despite what the internet forums will tell you that every change needs a tune. I mean, I've seen people change their throttle bodies and say you need a tune, or you don't need a tune for every little part. Just because you added under-drive pulleys or a different plenum or a different air filter does not mean you need to rush out and get a tune. Now there are some areas that you do need to get a tune if you change some things, like for instance fuel injector size. You're going to need a tune for that, or certain mass airflow sensors, you will need a tune for that too. But we're going to cover that as we go along. Just the point I'm trying to get across with right now is that once you get a 93 tune, which you should do that pretty early in your build so you can get your ignition timing bumped up, because that's where you're going to get a good grunt of your power at. You don't have to get a tune for every little change you make, and I'm going to show you how to kind of watch things so you know when you definitely have gone too far and you need a tune. And the way to do that is by watching your fuel trims. And remember, I pointed out the scanner. You're going to need some way to scan your computer and data log, so you're going to keep track of your fuel trims as you're going along. There are several ways to tune a car. One way is with a handheld tuner that you can buy from like SCT or some other dyno tuner. They usually have one stock. Another way, what that does is it plugs in your computer and it flashes the computer and then you unplug it. Another way is by a chip. They have these chips right here. Several brands sell them, including SCT, and the tuner will tune the chip and slide the chip in your computer, and it can do pretty much everything that a flash does. It just has to have a chip in it instead, and that chip will stay in your car's computer from that point on. Once you have a good tune and everything's good, your car will generally make corrections to any mild changes you make from that point on. But in order for it to make these corrections, it has to have two good things without a doubt. First off, it needs good O2 sensors, the front O2 sensors. Both of them need to be good, healthy shape, and then it needs a good, clean mass airflow sensor. You can't Google how to clean a mass airflow sensor. There's instructions all over the place to clean them up, but make sure yours is good and clean, and that you have a good set of O2 sensors in your car. On the display right now, you'll see down here at the bottom I have my long-term field trim here for the bank number 2 and long-term field trim for the bank number 1. You don't have to be too concerned about the short term. Short term is just experimenting, or it's going a little bit above and a little bit below the air-fuel ratio, what the long term is at, and trying to zero it in and get a better setting, and then whatever it finds, it applies that to the long term. So your main focus is going to be on the long-term field trims. You want them to be as close to 0 as you can. This car is not running right now, that's why everything's on 0. But you want the field trims to be as close to 0 as you can. If it goes up in the plus, you really don't want it any higher than like 10. You want to keep it in the single digits. I know when it gets up to 20, it kicks up a check engine light and letting you know you have a rich condition or a lean condition. If it goes into negative, more negative than 20, then it'll show that it has a rich condition. So you want to keep it in the single digits for the most part. The closer to 0, the better. But most cars are not going to ride on 0 everywhere they go. To see a +3 or -3 is totally normal. Don't panic. That's just, your car fine-tuning things. And a quick rundown how that works. We'll start with idle, and we'll talk about part throttle, and we'll talk about full throttle. And I'll be keeping this pretty simple so I don't clog you up with a whole bunch of information. But if you want to know more about this, there's lots of web pages that speak on this topic. When you're at idle, there's the mass airflow sensor right here sensing how much air is coming into this motor, and it knows the RPMs. It knows you're at idle. And so it says, okay, at idle, when this amount of air is coming in here, I know I'm preset to assume the perfect setting for that, the fuel setting, will be such and such. So it sends a signal to the injectors to give the motor that much fuel. Then it tests its calculations down there at the O2, the oxygen sensors, and it lets it know if it's running a little bit rich or a little bit lean. It's shooting for 14.7. So if it senses that it's a little bit lean, then it says, okay, my perfect setting that I'm tuned to assume that that's the perfect setting, it's actually run a little bit lean than that based on what we're seeing at O2. So let's bump the fuel trim up in the positive a little bit and see how that does. So it'll bump the fuel trim up in the positive, and then it'll recheck it at the O2 sensor there. And after a while, it applies that to the long-term fuel trims, which means it's kind of permanently set for the most part. It's really slow changing. And that's going to be there every time it comes back down to idle. It goes right to that. And what that is, the long-term fuel trim is taking that perfect setting that's in the tables of the air-fuel ratio, and it's making corrections since it sees that things are a little bit different. Either send it correction in the positive or negative, and that is your long-term fuel trim. So when you see a +1 on your long-term fuel trim, what it's saying is it's giving it +1 more fuel over the preset table that's built in the computer that they would assume would have been the perfect setting, but things are a little bit different. And every car is going to be a little bit different. Parts age, things change, and that's why they do this, to make sure that it does stay at 14.7 air-fuel ratio that it's sensing at coming out the through the exhaust system at the O2 sensors. And that part throttle, it does the same thing. Let's say you're giving it 25% throttle. It's going to sense the amount of air that's coming through the mass airflow sensor, and it's going to go to its predetermined tables that are set in the computer, which is your 0 fuel trim. It's going to start with that. It's going to say when this much air is coming through here at such and such RPM, I know that we need this much fuel based on the tables I have. It's going to apply that fuel. It's going to check the O2 sensors and see what they say. If they say we're lean, we're below 14.7 or above 14.7, it's going to make corrections in the fuel trims, either plus or minus, and that way, and the next time you give it throttle and it reaches that area, that amount of air coming in through the intake, through the mass airflow sensor, it's going to instantly know, last time we saw this much air at this many RPMs and such, we found through our testing that the perfect fuel trim was this. So it's going to go to that right away, and it'll recheck it, and it's constantly checking in the background and making little corrections. But that's what the long-term fuel trims are for, is to make them little corrections. Now at full throttle, that's when things get a little bit different, because at full throttle, these cars do have to run at a different air-fuel ratio than 14.7. They have to run richer than that to, save the catalytic converters from getting too hot. To keep the motor from getting too hot. Motors typically like more fuel at full throttle. That's just, and under full load, that's just how it is. But these O2 sensors are not wideband, they're narrowband, so they really can't tell the computer where it's at except if it's above or below 14.7. That's all it really can tell the computer. So what it does at that point at full throttle is it does not pay attention to the O2 sensors anymore, since they're useless at that point, and it just pays attention to the mass airflow sensor, how much air is coming in here, and it knows for such and such amount of air at such and such RPMs to add such and such fuel. It has no way of checking itself, but that's fine. But the beauty of that is you can make changes within a certain range. You can make changes to your car and not have to rush out and to get a tune. For instance, what I mean by that is if you put a different plenum and throttle body that now allows more air to flow into the motor, you don't have to go out and get a tune just because you did that, because the mass airflow sensor is going to sense that this motor is now getting more air, and it will add the adequate amount of extra gas that it needs for that more air. As long as your mass airflow sensor is not maxed out and your fuel injector is not maxed out, it will keep up with the demand as you start adding the mods and it starts bringing in more air. This mass airflow is going to pick that up and it's going to add the extra gas to it. And that's why you don't have to rush out and get a tune every time you make a change to your car, for the most part. So you already have I'll give you an example, you already have a 93 octane tune in your car, and you change from one brand cold air intake system to another brand cold air intake system. How do you know if you need a tune or not? You can tell by paying attention to your long-term field trims at both idle and part throttle. As long as they don't go too wacky, as long as they're still in the single digits, you're fine. If they start jumping into the double digits, then you either double check your work, make sure all your sensors still correct, scan your computer, make sure everything's still good. And if everything's still good, then you can assume that it just stepped too far out, and at that point you're going to have to get a tune. But as long as you stay in the single digits, you're going to be fine, and you can just keep moving forward. That way you can save a little bit of money to buy some more parts until you finally get enough stuff going on that you definitely do need another tune. At that point, instead of just getting a 93 octane can tune or something, at that point you might want to consider taking it to someone actually getting a dyno tune. But the point is that I'm getting across is you can make a lot of changes without changing your tune. Once you have that 93 octane tune in there, you can start stacking some mods on and you will get power increasement and everything will be good. Just keep track of your fuel trim. As long as they stay in the single digits, you should be good. Fuel injectors are one thing. Like I mentioned, you will need a tune if you change them out. However, the good news is the 19-pound injectors that these cars come with, you won't have to change them out until you start getting over 300 horsepower, in my opinion. Up to 300 horsepower, you're relatively safe. I've had this car as high as 314 horsepower on 19s. Wasn't optimum, yes, I get it. But I would say as long as you're like 295 or whatever, still you're going to be okay with the 19s. Some point in this video you'll see we do go up to the 24-pound injectors. So you're going to want to stick with the stock injectors for right now until you're ready to move up to the next level. However, you can change the mass airflow sensor out there without getting a dyno tune, but you have to be careful which ones you get. And I'll show you the ones that we have found that you can change to without really affecting the tune, and it flows more air. I was lucky on this car. It came with the Ford Racing one when I first bought it. It's a little bit bigger than the stock. It was already on there, and that's a plug-and-play mass airflow sensor. You can plug it in, and you don't need to go get a tune. I don't think they sell them anymore, but my brother found that the 03 and the 04 mass airflow sensor on the Mustang GT 2-valve motor, the 4.6, is slightly bigger than the 96 to the 02 mass airflow sensor. Let me show you a picture here. On the left is the 1996 to 2002 mass airflow sensor. You can see that huge divider in the middle, and then on the right here, that's the 03 and 04. You can see that they've removed a lot of stuff in the middle, and that's mainly where the flow, increase in flow is at. Plus it is slightly bigger. You can see how it downsizes up in there a little bit. So it's a little bit bigger diameter, and it doesn't have as big of a tower in the middle blocking the airflow. He plugged that in on his car, no problem. On his 01, he didn't have to go out and get a dyno tune. So if you want to get a bigger mass airflow sensor and you don't want to rush out for a dyno tune right away, that's a good one to get from the 03 to the 04 Mustang GT 2-valve. And you're going to need that bigger mass airflow at some point. So you might as well go ahead and go on eBay right now. Look for a 0304 mass airflow sensor. It looks like the one that I showed you in the picture, and bolt her on. And now that you officially have your 93 octane can tune, or whatever type of tune you have, it is good to have one heat range colder plug. I prefer to use these TR6IX. They're your iridium plugs. But whatever plug you use, make sure that you one heat range colder. That's the main. Because when you get a tune, most time, like if you order a can tune, they tell you to run one plug colder. But if they didn't, just know it's good to do. They have bumped up your ignition timing. Things are going to get a little bit hotter in there. You're typically, if you're doing this type of stuff, is because you're driving the car harder. You're going to want one heat range colder plug. And like I said, that's a really good plug to go with. My brother preferred the copper ones himself, but whatever you choose, just make sure it's one heat range colder. And you will want to gap the plugs to 54 thousandths. That's the OEM gap. I have tried running tighter gaps. There's no improvement there. Just run 54 thousandths and you'll be good. As well as right now would be a good time to also get a 180 thermostat. That's one of the things they suggest when you get a tune, is to get a 180 degree thermostat. And it's pretty important because most tunes are preset to turn your fan on at, I believe, 190 degrees. Now the stock, I know this one turns on at 190 degrees, but the stock thermostat is 192 degree thermostat. So if you don't get the colder thermostat, your fan's going to be on all the time. Most tunes are set to turn your fan on at 190 degrees and then shut them back off when they get below 180, because they expect you to have a 180 degree thermostat in. Don't go colder than 180. It can cause problems. Just put the 180 in there and that will be good. And now is a good time to pick up a good plenum and throttle body. There's several brands out there. I currently have a C&L on the car. However, before that, I did have a Professional Products. These are pretty readily available on eBay. As you can see, I did a little bit of mild port in there in this one. But anyway, these are pretty readily available on eBay. They're far better than the stock one. The problem with the stock one is it's too sharp. The roof is too low in here, and it's too sharp of a bend, and it's just real restricted up in this area. So that's what these try to achieve. I know C&L makes them, or used to make them. AccuFab, BBK. There's so many different brands out there, but you're going to want to get a plenum for it. And a throttle body. Just go ahead and get the 75 millimeter. It doesn't make a difference really. If you might as well just go for the biggest one you can fit on the car. But that's another reason why you need an aftermarket plenum, is for the bigger throttle body. If you read reviews and stuff, you'll see that, you know, on a relatively stock car, they were able to achieve like a maximum of a 6 horsepower increasement by running this. But I speculate that once the car gets closer to 300 horsepower or higher, that this starts becoming a bottleneck if you don't replace it. You have to get some aftermarket performance one on like this. You're going to need that, so you might as well order that up. And when you go to mount your plenum up, this is the intake manifold for the car. When you put the 4 bolts in that holds the plenum on there, if you put them in there loosely and not tighten them all the way down, you'll find there's a little bit of wiggle, right? So what you want to do is you want to slide your hand up into here while you have the bolt in and feel around. Or you can look in there with the light and find out which way you can slide this thing so that it matches this hole up perfectly, because otherwise a lot of times you'll find that there's a spot that it overhangs, and it overhangs into the flow. So you want to, as smooth of a transition, you want to blueprint it, so to say. So with these loose, you find out the best position and then tighten them up. And you want to do the same for the throttle body too, as you're bolting the throttle body on. What you'll do is you'll put the 4 bolts in there, you open the throttle body and look in there, and you move it around till you see that lip, move it around till you remove the lip altogether, and you get a smooth transition all the way in there. And that's where you're going to want to sit it. Basically, you're just trying to remove any potential for turbulence going through the intake tract. On this intake manifold right here, you can see where I hit it with a porting tool right here and sharpen that lip up, because no matter what I did, this lip right here and this lip right here on the other side both kept protruding into the intake. I could move this around, but both sides will always keep protruding. So all I did was take a porting tool, I smoothed it all the way up. You have to leave enough lip to hold this gasket in place, but I was able to do that and get a nice smooth transition going from the plenum to the intake manifold. Again, any brand will work for these. Any aftermarket performance brand is going to be better than stock. That's what I'm trying to say. I personally like the C&L right now. I've been digging that, but this did me good for a lot of years. This is basically a copy of the Trick Flow, the professional products. It's just a copy of the Trick Flow plenum. And on eBay, you can get these 75mm throttle bodies for like 50 or 60 bucks. So might as well grab a nice big 75mm one. For you guys with the 96 and 98 with spark plug wires and these coil packs. The stock coil packs are great. They're just fine. I have Screaming Demon on mine, but honestly I only did that just because I needed new coil packs. As long as yours are good, you're good. But you'll definitely want to upgrade your spark plug wires to something 8mm. I got these Ford Racing ones right here. I'm sorry, 9mm. I keep saying 8mm. 9mm spark plug wires. For you guys with the coil-on plugs from 99 to 2004, you really don't have to do anything. Your coil-on plugs, as long as they're good, they're good. You want to make sure you keep good boots on them. You can replace these. You can buy a pack of them for pretty cheap and replace it. When these go bad and they get hard and they allow moisture to seep in here and causes misfires, and which eventually weakens the coil as well. So, but for the most part, you don't have to go chasing high-end coils unless your coils are bad and you want to spend the money. The motor oil that I prefer is Shell Rotella. I use the 1030 Shell Rotella. They sell it in different weight oils, so if you need like 540 or whatever. Yes, it is technically a diesel oil, but just do a little bit of research. It won't hurt your car. It's better than your typical oils that they sell nowadays for the cars. Because of EPA regulations with catalytic converters and everything, they've kind of stripped out a lot of the good stuff out of your motor oils. But most of the people in the know are either using a high-end racing oil or just Shell Rotella. And even though your oil filler cap might say 520, I would not run 520, no less than 1030 in these cars. They originally were designed for 1030. It was in America. In the later years of that motor, they started suggesting 520. And that was mainly for fuel economy reasons, but it does not offer as good a protection. I have heard of many of these cars running for hundreds of thousands of miles on 1540. I've done it myself. I currently use 1030, but don't use 520. Just use 1030 at the thinnest. The OEM Motorcraft oil filter is the best for this. I did try Wix one time. I know Wix is real popular in the car world, and I was getting timing chain chatter on cold startups that which indicated to me that there's a one-way valve in the oil filter. It's supposed to hold the oil up in the system when you shut off your car instead of letting it just all drain back down to the pan. It kind of let me know that one-way valve was either not working or there wasn't one in it, because I would start the car up and I would hear a little bit of timing chain chatter for a couple of seconds until the tensioners primed up, which was not normal for this car because it usually just starts up and doesn't make a sound. I pulled that filter out, put a Motorcraft back in it, and that went away right away. So I only use a Motorcraft in this one because of that reason. These things like to peel out a lot because they don't have a lot of weight in the rear end. They're pretty much a bucket on the tail end. They just don't have a lot of weight on the rear tires. So you're going to want to get a good set of rims and wheels. The reason I said rims is most likely if you're planning on putting some power in it, you're going to want to get a staggered set where the rear is wider than the front. This currently has a 10-inch on the rear, and if I remember correctly, they're 9-inch up front, the width. But they're 18-inch rims. But the point I'm trying to get across here is you're going to want to fit some pretty decent rubber on the rear end to get some traction. In my experience on these cars, with a summer tire or a street tire, you cannot expect to ever get a better 0 to 60 of 5 seconds. I've tried. I was never able to do it. 5 seconds was my cap until I put on some drag radials. So if you really want to get down into the fours, you're going to need at least a set of drag radials to get some hook on the street and at the drag strip. Aluminum drive shaft. That's a nice addition to add as well. It will shave a few pounds off the car. Plus, it is rotating mass underneath the car, so it does technically free up a little bit of horsepower. Maybe not anything too crazy or too noticeable, but it does do it. And the best part is, though, it is lighter. So if you're going to be running this car at extreme high speeds, it's nice to have a lightweight drive shaft that's less likely to come out of balance, or any out of balances that are in it are very minute, versus if you had a steel one that gets a little bit out of balance. And for you manual guys, aluminum drive shaft is real good at absorbing shock on hard, heavy shifts when you're just shifting like a gorilla and popping the clutch out into the next gear. It definitely absorbs some of the shock. When I had a steel drive shaft on it, a tough hard shift was more like a gah! And afterwards it was more like a boom. So it softens that up. So if you have a manual and you're running it hard, aluminum drive shaft's worth it just for that. Lower control arms. I have some Maximum Motorsport lower control arms in this one. If you end up wearing out your control arm bushings on your stock control arms, instead of trying to replace the stock control arms or the stock control arm bushings, just go ahead and get some lower control arms. They definitely tighten up your ride. I will suggest, and I prefer, the polyurethane ones, both front and rear of the lower control arm. Both sides are polyurethane. It's just a street car, so you know. Now, if you're drag racing a lot, I understand, then you might want the solid ones. But for a street car, I want the car to be as smooth as stock was, and not to beat itself up with all the cracks and bumps in the road. You know, it's an old car. I'm just trying to take care of it. I want it to drive nice. So I went with the polyurethane bushings on it, and it's been good. And even with your camber caster plates to do your alignment, which we're going to get to that a little bit later in the video on the alignments on these, but I prefer the BBK ones because it does come with the polyurethane rubber bushing instead of some of the solid ones that send a lot of noise. I did try one of the solid ones on this car that just has a solid metal bearing. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But you're gonna hear every little and just all. If it's a street car, keep everything nice and rubber insulated. Just go ahead and get the grip BBK ones with the rubber. It gives you all the full range of adjustment that all the other ones give you, but at the same time, it's not going to bring the noise that the other ones can bring. These are some cheapy eBay camber and caster plates, but you can see the metal little ball bearing, whatever they have in here. That's what most of these aftermarket ones use instead of using the rubber ones that I just showed you that the BBK grips use. Hey, dude. So anyway, yeah, these bring a lot of road noise, and it kind of takes out the comfort of a daily driver. And I highly recommend the BBK ones it's the only one that I know that gives you adjustable camber caster plate while still having polyurethane or rubber bushings. I like them. And this is the brand O2 sensor that I prefer for your oxygen sensors. I found these to hold up really well and do good. They're made by NGK. This is the clutches from the limited slip differential on the 8.8 rears of the Mustang. In stock form, they come with 3 friction plates, the fiber plates here. And let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 steel plates. Is that 4? Yeah. So what the modification does, there's websites that will walk you through it, but the modification to get more grip out of your limited slip to assure both your tires are hooking up and not one is not spinning faster than the other, but they're both locked in together, is to rearrange the pack where you can fit 5 or 4 friction plates in there. There's a lot of websites that will walk you through the process of doing that, and but that's a modification you're going to want to do, not only for better traction but for safety, because when both your tires are locked together and producing the same amount of power on the ground, the car is far easier to control. It shoots straighter, and when the rear end does drift out a little bit, it doesn't get goofy as it sends power from one tire to the next. It will keep the power equal on both tires and keep the car more stable and easier to control. So you're going to want to do the clutch pack mod to your rear end. This car has a return fuel system, which means the excess fuel that gets up to the fuel pressure regulator, after it makes enough pressure that it needs the excess fuel, it sends back to the tank. But on the 99 and newer, they have a return list fuel system. 1998 is some weird hybrid. I don't know much about that one, but I know 96 and 97 is a return fuel system, and 99 to 04 is a returnless fuel system. On the 96 to 90 and 97, like this one right here, I put a 190 Walbro 190 liters, liter per hour pump in it. I did try the 225. That's real popular, but I found that it was producing more flow than what my return lines could handle, and I just couldn't get the pressure at idle down to the proper pressure it was supposed to be. So I found 190 work good. I would highly suggest the 190 over 225 for that aspect. On you guys with the newer ones, the 99 to 04, you can actually keep track of your fuel pressure by scanning your live data. So that's a good thing to do, because your car does have a fuel pressure sensor on it that it's sending to the computer to let the computer know what the pressure's at. It's good to go out and punch your car and ring it out all the way to the end in like second gear or something, and watch your fuel pressure and make sure it's holding up. Make sure it's not dropping as the RPMs and the power's coming up. That might indicate that your pump is getting weak. And for us guys with the 96 and 97, we actually have to buy a fuel pressure gauge, and we connect it right here, and we have a fuel pressure regulator right there. What I do is I connect my fuel pressure gauge right there, and I run the hose to it right up here, and I angle it so I can see it while I'm driving the car. I go out and punch the car and make sure it's holding this pressure. Now this car should be at about 39 psi. They say anywhere from 38 to 40 is fine, so I just shoot for 39. How you adjust these is you just pull that cap off, connect your fuel pressure regulator on there, pull the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator. At this point you should have an adjustable one. If yours is stock or a non-adjustable one, you're going to want to get rid of that and get an adjustable one, because the non-adjustable ones are often off. I found them as low as 36 psi. So go and get yourself an adjustable one. Any brand will work. There's several brands out there, just as long as you can adjust it. And you pull the vacuum line off, so that's out of the way, and you make your adjustments at idle until you see 39 psi. When you connect this back up, it usually drops about 9 or 10 psi when that's connected back up, so it should drop down to about 29 psi with that connected at idle. However, when you go full throttle, there is no vacuum. This will receive no vacuum, so this will now produce 39 psi of pressure as if this was disconnected. That's what you're checking at full throttle when you go to ride it and drive it. You want to make sure that it stays at 39 psi all the way up. Now it can dip a little bit. It happens at full throttle. The injectors are taking the fuel in quick. You might see a little bit of a droppage, maybe a psi 2 max, so it might dip down maximum from 39 to 37 maybe. But if you go any lower than that, like if you go down to 36, you're going to want to replace your fuel pump and figure out what's going on there. On the 96 and 97 with the return fuel pump, one of the issues with them is not only that the fuel pump's really not that powerful, and trust me, it's really not, but the biggest problem is it doesn't really receive a lot of electricity, a lot of power. The wires going to it are very thin, and if you go, what I did on my cars, I went back here one day while I was idling, I hooked a voltmeter up to the power line as it was running the fuel pump, and it was reading about 1.5 volts lower than what I was getting at the battery, which that told me there was a huge amount of resistance on that wire going back there to the pump. So what I did is I ran a auxiliary wire. There's a black wire right up in here, and it goes right into my fuse box. I have it connected to a fuse, so it is fused. And just like if I was connecting an amp in the trunk, you know, a big old car audio amplifier, I ran a nice thick wire. You can see it's the black wire right here in the middle. I ran that all the way back into the trunk to a relay, and I took the original wires that powered up the fuel pump and I connected them to the relay, so they will turn on the relay instead of running the pump. They just trigger the relay, and then the relay will send power from that nice thick wire that I have all the way to the pump. That way there's no voltage droppage. By doing that, I was able to get away with just the stock fuel pump on this for quite a while as I was adding up the modifications, so I started seeing some dipping, and that is when I went to the 190. But before that, I was already getting some dipping. I did this modification of adding the relay and a bigger power wire, and that bought me a lot of time for a lot of years. I was able to really stack on a lot of mods, and the fuel pressure was staying up. It wasn't dipping. Finally, when I put the camshafts in and stuff, I started getting some dipping, and that's when I went ahead and upgraded to the 190. But what I'm trying to say is keep track of your fuel pressure at full throttle. Make sure it's not dipping excessively. A pound, maybe 2 pounds might be acceptable. Any more than that, and you might want to go digging. And this is what I would call stage 2 of the build. We are at the end of stage 2 of the build. We're about to go to stage 3. Stage 3 is where we'll be adding camshafts. We're actually going to start opening the motor and doing a few things that are harder, like long tube headers, adding the camshafts, maybe even ported and polished heads. That's what I'm calling stage 3 of this build. So this is pretty much the end of stage 2. For the stage 2, I'm going to say for the 96 and 98 guys, it is getting some PI heads, cams, and intake on there. And then for all of us from 96 to 2004, it would include getting the clutch pack mod done on your rear end so that both your limited slip, both your wheels grip evenly. Getting the rear gears you want, getting some good traction on it, getting your fuel system sorted out. For you manual guys, getting a good short throw shifter. For the auto guys, make sure you do the J mod as well as some tuning in the tune to help firm up your shifts. A good 93 octane tune. A good H-pipe or X-pipe, preferably off-road, with a good catback system. For the 96 and 97 guys, an adjustable fuel pump regulator with all your fuel system sorted out, making sure your fuel pressure is good. And all of your bolt-on stuff, from a 180-degree thermostat, under-drive pulleys, 1 heat range colder plugs, a good aftermarket plenum with a 75mm throttle body, a good cold air induction, as well as make sure you have a good ignition system. And also don't forget the 03 to 04 mass airflow sensor. And again, no matter what mass airflow sensor you use, get rid of that screen. That screen is robbing you about 10 horsepower. At this point, you will have a Mustang that should be able to do about 5 seconds flat, 0 to 60. Maybe a little bit quicker if your traction is really good and you got a good set of gears. But you're looking at a 5-second flat car. To get quicker than 5 seconds flat, that's where we're going to start entering stage 3. Stage 3 is going to consist of 24-pound injectors, some stage 1 cams, and long tube headers, as well as another dyno tune at that point. And lastly, possibly some ported and polished cylinder heads. It's not necessary, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. I did install some in my car, and I'll let you know the benefits of that and where that can take you. Going for another drive, I'm going to point at the long-term fuel trims right here. You want to pay attention to them as you drive around when you make changes. See where your long-term fuel trims are at cruising speed, part throttle ranges, holding steady, and also at idle. You don't want to worry so much about full throttle when it comes to fuel trims, because at full throttle, fuel trims are not being used. But like I said, at idle, just keep track of them. They should be close to 0, but if they get, a little, as long as they're in the single digits, they're okay. I'm going to check the mass airflow at full throttle, take it all the way to its highest RPMs, red line. And then I'm going to look at the maximum number, the maximum value for the mass airflow, and that's going to let me know how my car's performing, what changes I made. When I first got the car, the max number was like 1,750. I'm not even kidding you. And that was with the PI heads and cams and stuff, but in the earlier days. And now it's up in the 2000s and go up in the 21s in the winter. Here we go. I'm going to try it again. Let's do it again. And that's how you check your mass airflow numbers. Turn around here I think I see a shady spot. Go in here, park in the shade, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Mustang. Alright, before we dig into stage 3 of the build, there are some things I need to cover so I don't get too far ahead of myself. First off, the G-Tech that you have been watching me use on my dash there for my 0 to 60 times and horsepower times, they don't make these anymore. This is a newer version right here. If you do pick one up on eBay or whatever, this is a good version right here to get, the Pro RR, or the black one that I have. The black one right there is a good one. That one works the same as the gray one, identically. But they don't make these anymore, but I do believe they have a newer model out that's big old digital display, and it's much more expensive. Also, nowadays they do have phone apps that can tell you all your 0 to 60, quarter mile, and stuff like that, since we had gyrometers, or whatever you call them things, on our phones nowadays. I haven't tried them out myself, but I hear they're pretty accurate. The biggest advantage of the G-Tech is it does know your engine's RPMs. It senses it through the electrical noise coming from the alternator, and that's what allows you to do horsepower runs. You see right there, it mentions it can do 0 to 60, 60 foot, 8 mile, quarter mile, horsepower and torque, and all that kind of stuff. It has shift lights and everything like that. But the horsepower, the dyno pools are pretty cool. Quick rundown how that works is you come to a dead stop, you hit the little button right here. It's all written in the instructions, but just a quick rundown. And as soon as the light starts blinking, you take off gently through first gear, you go to second gear, and then you punch it. And you hold it in second gear all the way to the red line, or I hold it all the way to the rev limiter. I bounce off the rev limiter once or twice. Shut it down and check it out. And it'll give you your horsepower runs. It shows a nice little, gives you a nice little dyno graph and everything. And really, that's the best way, without actually going to a dyno, to get your dyno numbers. Now, there is another way. You can keep track of your mass airflow sensor numbers. This won't tell you how fast the car is doing if you pay attention to these numbers at full throttle, what the computer's reading from the mass airflow sensor with your data logger. But it will let you know how much air is going in the motor. And obviously, for air to get going, the motor has to be able to get out. So if you change the exhaust system, you throw on like a catback or off-road H-pipe or something, any changes you make to the flow, to the in and the out, to the intake tube, the plenum, throttle body, cylinder heads, intake manifold, anything like that, you want to pay attention to your full throttle mass airflow sensor readings. Let me show you what I mean. On the torque app that I've been showing you guys, if you set up a mass airflow sensor pod, you can choose which type of pod you want. But if you choose one of the ones that shows the highest value, all you have to do is go and punch your car and take it all the way to red line, preferably in second gear where you have good traction, and you'll see the highest value right there. Today, my highest value is 2073 in this weather. This car, the highest it can get in cold weather would be 2145 or 2155 or something. That's the highest I've seen in cold weather. The mass airflow sensor tells it the mass of the air that's coming in. So on hot, humid days, you're going to get lower numbers, and on cool, crisp nights, you're going to get higher numbers. So keep that in mind. So if you make a change, try to keep it in the same weather. Like if you're doing a throttle body change, do a run, pay attention to your highest value at full throttle on your mass airflow sensor by taking it all the way to the top end of your motor, because that's where you're going to get your highest numbers, right at the red line, right before it bounces off the rev limiters, where you're going to get your highest numbers. Pay attention to that. Come back, make a change real quick, and go back out before the weather changes and try again. Whichever one gives you the highest numbers, it's going to be promoting the highest flow, which is going to give you the highest horsepower. And using that method is a good way to tell if you, if you're creating more flow through the motor. It's not going to tell you if you made your car faster because you put underdrive pulleys, because that has nothing to do with the flow. Or if you change your gearing, that has nothing to do with the flow. So you'll need a G-Tech or an app on your phone that can tell you a 0 to 60 to get them type of numbers. But if you're just paying attention, if you're doing something flow related and you want to know which one's better, let's say you want to know which air filter is better, just pay attention to mass airflow numbers at full throttle. That'll let you know. Another thing I need to cover before we move on to stage 3 is Some people are going to be tempted to do the coil unplug, the cop conversion. The guys that have the what is it, 96 to 98 models. I chose not to do it on this car because on my previous car, my Crown Vic that I did the PI swap on, I did convert that over to coil and plugs, and I saw no improvement at all. Actually, it was a little bit worse in reliability. You're more likely to have a coil go out or moisture get in them with the coil and plugs. This is actually a more reliable system in my opinion. So if you have this system on your car with the coil packs, just stick with that. In my opinion, it's a more reliable system and it's just as powerful, if not more. And if your car is staying nice and cool, then good. But this one, with the higher compression, the camshafts, and all of that, it started with the AC on going down the interstate on a hot summer day here in Florida. The temperature could get up to about 200 degrees going down the interstate, and that wasn't acceptable because I have a 180 degree thermostat in there. Should be a little bit down closer to 180 to 190. I don't want it getting up to 200 or higher. So I ended up putting just the aftermarket bigger radiator on it, aluminum radiator here. It's been good. So it's a higher capacity radiator. I picked it up on eBay for like $170 something, and yeah, it keeps my temperatures nice and cool. For you manual guys, if you still have the stock clutch quadrant, all you have to do is just lift the clutch pedal up real high and pull it up pretty hard. You might hear it click if it's making an adjustment, and then push it back down. And that's how you take up any slack in the cable. It automatically adjusts itself when you pull it up real hard and push it down. It will automatically adjust itself. Some of you guys, if you bought the car from someone else, they might have put an aftermarket one in already that you have to actually manually adjust. I believe you'll manually adjust that down here somewhere. But I don't have that on this car. I've stuck with the stock one because I actually like the auto adjustment. It doesn't give me any problems at all. Another tip is when you go to add on an aftermarket throttle body, a bigger throttle body, you're going to have to tune in the idle little adjustment screw right here. The best way to tune that in is to disconnect your idle speed control right here. You disconnect that while the car is idling. It might die if this is set too low, so keep that in mind. You might have to turn this up a little bit and then unplug it. And what you want to do is you want to set your RPMs with that unplugged. You want to use this to control your RPMs and set them to about 100 RPMs lower than what your car typically idles at. With a stock tune, I think they idle at about 700 RPMs or so. So set it to idle at 600 RPMs with this unplugged. Set that to where it's idle about 600, then plug that back in and you're good. After you get a tune, they typically like to bring your idle up to 800 or maybe 850. And if that's the case, same thing. Unplug that, set this to about 100 RPMs lower than what your normal idle is, and plug that back in. And that's how you set that. It's just a street car, so suspension upgrades are not all that great or crazy on this one. I just, like I mentioned earlier in the video, I have some lower springs. I didn't go too low. I don't want to have to like creep over speed bumps. Plus I have long tube headers. I don't want to dent my headers because of the speed bump. I do have the Ford Racing springs in this one, and just some KYB shocks, and they do the trick. That's been my suspension upgrades. I did use some polyurethane sway bar bushings up front. Them are always good to add on, as well as polyurethane rack and pinion bushings. And like I mentioned earlier in the video at the beginning, the brakes, all I did was upgrade these brakes to the 99 to 2004 brakes up front, and that's really all I've done for brake upgrades. A lot of people do like to convert them to the Cobra brakes, but just keep in mind, if you do the Cobra brakes, they are heavier rotors. Even the back is a heavier rotor, and that's going to add more spinning weight, which is going to make it a little bit harder for your car to accelerate. I don't know how much it's going to shave away at your overall acceleration, but anytime you add weight to your wheels, it definitely does that. If you do opt for the Cobra conversion, I almost did. I did a lot of research in it. If you do go that route, I would suggest at least doing it both front and rear. A lot of people only do the front and they think they're good with it, but brake balance is real important. I would say do the front and the rear. And as far as I know, on a lot of these cars too, you're going to need the master cylinder from the Cobra too, because there's a different ratio. So, you know, do your research. There's a lot of forums and websites where they document all this and step by steps. Just do your research before you do it. If you're going to do it though, I would say don't half-ass it. Make sure you get the brake master cylinder and do the front and the rear. When you drop your car, it will give you more camber. You'll notice that your front wheels, when you lower your car, I should say, you'll notice your front wheels will angle like that. That's okay to a certain degree. It does help with the handling of this car, but that's where the camber caster plates come into play. Online, you'll find a lot of people's recipe of what they would call a performance alignment. You can play with it with yourself. What I did is I used a level from a phone, and well, this app is not quite working right now for whatever reason, but you can see it tells me the degrees as I turn my phone right here. And what I do is I take the phone out of the case. I use a metal ruler, and I just kind of hold it right up against the wheel here, connecting to the rim right here and the rim right there. It has to be a nice straight metal ruler, and you can set your phone on it and it'll tell you the degrees of your camber. Make sure you're parked on a very flat surface when you do that, and you can sit there and you can adjust your camber right here to anywhere. I would suggest anywhere from 0.7 degrees to 1.2 degrees for the street. And anytime you make a change to your camber like that, you're going to want to roll the car forward and back, let the wheels resettle, and then check again. Make your changes, roll the car forward and back, let it settle, and make your changes again. And of course, make sure you try to keep it even, both left and right. As for the toe on this car, in my experience, zero toe is perfect, meaning both wheels are pointed perfectly straight on this car. Some people say toe it in a little bit, give it a little bit of toe in for stability. Some people say give it a little bit of toe out, helps it dive into the corners a little quicker. Or I might have it backwards, I don't know. But I tried both in this car, and I found zero gives me the sharpest response and the best steering. And the way I do that is with measuring tape. I just, about 6 inches off the ground here, I take and put a measuring tape right in the middle of that groove right there and run it all the way to the other side of the tire and compare it to the groove over there. And I do on the front side and the back side, and I keep changing my toe until the numbers are equal, which means both tires are pointed perfectly straight. Obviously, you also want to have your front wheel straight too. If you get it zeroed out perfectly, toe, but your front wheel is a little bit crooked, all you have to do is just turn both wheels one way or the other until you get your steering wheel straight too. But that's how you do your alignment at home. As far as the caster is basically how far the camber caster plate is pulled back, how far the strut is angled back. That is, it's a preference thing. I believe the more you angle it back, the more stable your car becomes, and the more you bring it forward, the easier the steering becomes. It becomes lighter steering. So it's more of a preference thing, and a lot of times the camber and caster plates that are aftermarket won't even allow you to get the caster into the stock position. They automatically shoot for a little bit back for stability, because from my understanding, most of the people that run these on the track do run a little bit more caster. And you can use your phone if you want to get exact degrees on that. You can use your phone too. They actually have apps. And to check the caster at home on my own, I use an app like this. These are the type of apps you use to like put your window frame or pictures up on the wall, make sure they're level and stuff. But you see down there, it shows me the degrees, the roll and pitch and all that. So you can get the degrees from there. But you'll see the gray line as I lean it. What I do is with a light, I'll put a light into the wheel here, see the strut, and I'll turn the phone to where the line matches the angle of the strut, and I'll look at the degrees. You do that on both sides, and you can at least make sure they're nice and equal. Stage 3, here we go. You see I'm pulling out my whole motor here. I'm swapping out that high mileage NPI bottom end for a low mileage NPI bottom end from a Grand Marquis. Gonna put some long tube headers on her. There's the engine bay empty. And there's my heads I bolted onto that fresh new NPI. Hey, remember that number? 58. And 58. We'll talk about that in a little bit here in stage 3. There's your cam chains. We've got a brand new clutch with a lightweight steel flywheel. There's the front side of the motor. And now there's the headers bolted on. You can see the fresh clutch back there with the lightweight steel flywheel. Interesting enough, when I went to go drop this motor in, I tried with both headers on. Oh, check that out. It's pretty cool. I tried with both headers on, but I found out I had to unbolt the right header, set it down in there, then drop the motor in with the left header bolted on the motor, and then I was able to connect the right header once it was down there. It's just what I had to do. I also added some comp cam stage 1 camshafts. About 2 months later, I went back in and added these CNC ported heads. And but yeah, we're going to enter stage 3 here. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here we go, stage 3. All right, time to start talking about stage 3. At this point, I've covered everything that what I would call stage 2, which is all your bolt-on stuff and addressing things like your rear end and fuel pump and everything like that. Stage 3 is where, you know, start adding camshafts, long tube headers, maybe poured and polished heads. But just to give you guys an idea, stage 2 is going to get you up to anywhere in the range of 265 to 280 rear wheel horsepower, give or take some, and a 0 to 60 of about 5 seconds flat, maybe a little bit quicker. You might be able to knock a 4.9, maybe, might be tough, but maybe a 4.8 if you have really optimized gearing and good traction. But for the most part, a 5 second flat car, 265 to 280 horsepower. But to dig way down into the 4 second range, 0 to 60, and to get up to 300 rear wheel horsepower and higher, you will have to enter stage 3. So let's talk about that. Usually by this point you've already started on some weight reduction. I'm not going to be able to help you out too much on what to strip out of the car. This was a GTS model. It's already a stripped down version, so it's already kind of pretty much lighter than stock at about 3,000 pounds. And since this is just a street car, it's not a race car, so I'm not going to go ripping out the back seats or anything like that. I mean, you can if you want to, but that's not something I'm looking to do on a daily drive or street car. But a couple tips I do have is, if you have the lower control arms already, you can go ahead and get rid of the quad shocks and the mounts that mount the quad shocks. The quad shocks are not the shocks that go up and down, but the ones right behind your front wheel here that run horizontally. Them are your quad shocks. Once you get lower control arms like I have on this car, you can pretty much chuck the quad shocks, and that drops some weight. And on your rear end, on the differential on the front side of the pumpkin there, you'll see, I already removed it, but you'll see there's a wishbone looking thing. It's rubber mounted. It weighs about 10 pounds. You can chuck that, especially if you're changing the gear ratio. That's supposed to remove some of the harmonic noises and stuff, but once you change your gear ratio, you can pretty much just throw that out the window. And of course, spare tire and jack in the trunk, you can chuck that too. And just avoid adding any unnecessary weight. If you want to keep your car light on its toes, it'll handle better, it'll stop faster, and it'll accelerate quicker. That's pretty much all I have for you as far as weight reduction. And I hope you've been keeping track of your fuel pressure. You're going to want to check that right as soon as you start working on this build and all the way through the process. These cars are getting a little older, and honestly the fuel system was kind of marginable in stock form. So for you guys in 1996 to mid-2001, you're going to want to pick up one of these fuel injection pump tester kits. You can pick these up at Harbor Freight for like 20 bucks, 25 bucks, something like that. That plugs right in your fuel rail. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, you can run the hose outside of the hood of the car, close the hood, and drive it down the road and punch it and see what PSI you're producing. You should be producing about 39 full throttle. Might drop a pound or two at full throttle, but that's okay. Any more than 2 pounds at full throttle and you better go digging. You don't want to get down to 3 pounds less. You want to keep it around 39, 38, 37 is the lowest you're going to want to see at full throttle. And that's just natural. They dip a little bit because the injectors are just taking the fuel real quick, and it's just kind of how the system works. For you guys with the 2001 mid-year to 2004, you can use it with a, you can check your fuel pressure with a data logging program or app like the Torque Pro here that I've been talking about. If you go to Google Play, just type in Torque Pro, and it only costs like $4.95. Use your cell phone with it, or if you have a live data scanner, you can watch your live data that way and see your fuel pressure. Watch it at full throttle, part throttle, and all that. If you use the Torque app, you will need a ELM 327, the Bluetooth one. You can pick these up on eBay, Amazon, whatever. Make sure you get a quality one. Some of the cheap ones are really difficult to get working, and if the first one doesn't work, send it back, get another one, and try again. Try from a different company, different vendor, whatever. But all cheap stuff. Keep track of your fuel pressure. Trust me, you're going to want to keep track of it, especially when you start adding camshafts and things like that. And a good tip for you guys that are not planning on using camshafts before we start getting into like the stage 1, 2, and 3 camshafts. For you guys that are just going to stick with the stock PI cams, here's a good tip. I have found firsthand by using the G-Tech and paying attention to the horsepower, doing horsepower runs, that These cars actually prefer the cams to be a little bit retarded over advanced if you want peak power. Or let me clarify, the stock PI cams like to be retarded over advanced as far as for reaching your peak power. I have verified this myself. It's somewhere in the range of about 96 horsepower gain over if your cams were advanced. Now, I'm not talking about buying aftermarket cam gears that are adjustable. I'm talking about with just a little bit of play that's in the cam gear stock. So here's my tip for you guys. And this is all I did back when I was running stock PI cams. If you loosen up the center bolt that holds your camshaft on, now this is for the Romeo motor. This doesn't, I do not know about the Windsor on this. So, but on the Romeo motor, if you loosen up the bolt that holds your camshaft and cam gear on, there's a little bit of play in that cam gear on the camshaft. You can rock it just a little bit. I read online that it's about a 4 degrees difference in cam timing, but what you want to do is you want to set that on the retarded end. But on the Romeo motor, if you loosen up the bolt that holds your cam gear onto your camshaft, and you take your camshaft and maybe either connect a pair of vice grips on it or a pair of pliers or whatever and twist it to the retarded side. Remember, the chain's pulling down the motor's pulling the chain on the tight side, not where the tensioner's at. It's pulling it down the tight side. So you would turn this camshaft this way, then tighten that bolt back up. That's retarding your camshaft. And as far as you can retard it in that little bit of play that they have kind of built in on the cutaway here. So retard both banks and you'll gain some power that way. Because honestly, you don't even know where they're at right now. You could have one advanced and one retarded. When they bolt them on in the factory, who knows, you know. But yeah, it only takes a few minutes. Just pop your valve covers off, loosen up these bolts. There's one on each side, and retard your camshaft. Tighten the bolt down real good. Make sure you use Loctite on it, and at least you know you're getting as much horsepower as you can out of them camshafts. I have that's been my experience, at least. Back when I was running the PI cams, I first had them both set retarded. I just erred on that, and one day I said, well, let me try advancing them and see what that does. So I pulled the valve covers off and I advanced them both with the amount that allows you to advance right up in here. I advanced them both, went back out, and yeah, the car did gain some torque up around the 3,000 to 3,500 RPM range, but it fell so flat after 5,500 versus when they were retarded that I went back home and pulled the valve covers back off and set them back retarded and got that top end pull back, which allows me to pull to 6,500. So if you're running the PI cams, I highly suggest setting them up on the retarded end with the amount of play that they give you in the stock cam gear on the stock camshafts. With what I'm calling stage 3, including camshafts, long tube headers, and ported heads, I'm going to say out of all 3 of these, the first one that you want to get if you're doing one step at a time will definitely be the camshafts. The second thing you want to add to that list would be the long tube headers. The long tube headers kind of work side by side with the camshafts too, so that's always good. And of course, the last thing would be the ported heads, and we'll get to that in a minute. As far as the intake manifold, we'll talk about that in a little bit. As you remember me saying, I don't want to sacrifice bottom end torque, and that's why I chose to stick with this intake, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. These are the camshafts that I am currently using, the Comp Cam Stage 1. These are the XE262AH camshafts. I've heard Modular Head Shop makes some really good camshafts for these cars too, although I have not tried out a set of these. But the Stage 1 comp cams are really good cams, or anything that's in this range. If you buy a Modular Head Shop cam shaft, you know, call them up first and find out what they would recommend is very similar to these as far as the range they work in, and you're going to be good. The beauty of the Stage 1 cams are they definitely increase horsepower. I'm talking about a good 30 horsepower, rear wheel horsepower, no kidding. And once you have all the other, if you already all the way up to a full Stage 2 build with all the bolt-ons and you just throw some of these on, 30 horsepower, maybe 35, right there, bam, just with the camshafts in Stage 1. And I'm not even kidding you. Now, You can go to stage 2 and maybe gain an extra 10 more horsepower on top of that. But at that point, you start sacrificing drivability and low end torque. Sure, the car might be a little bit quicker going down the quarter mile when you keep the RPMs up, but driving around town, it's not going to be as enjoyable. It's going to be kind of soggy, and it's just not going to be the same. So for daily driver, street car, I totally suggest the stage 1 camshafts. It'll give you a good boost in horsepower, good extra boost in the top end pull. It took my peak RPMs, my peak horsepower used to happen at about 5,200 RPMs. It brought that up to 5,800 RPMs. And a stage 1 cam, you can rev them out all the way to 6,700 easily. That's what my rev limiter set at, and has no problem going all the way up to the rev limiter without even running out of breath or seeming like it's starting to run short. Matter of fact, I don't even know it's time to shift until I hit the rev limiter, so I got to watch that tack. So these are great cams. I didn't really lose any bottom end, maybe some sub bottom, like I would say like sub bottom, like below 1,600 RPMs. I might have lost a little bit of power there, but as soon as you get up to around the 2,000 RPM range, it makes it as much torque as the stock cams. And once you get over like 4,500, it starts making more power than the stock cams all the way up to the rev limiter. So definitely goodbye. It is a good buy. Obviously, it's advised and it's best to degree your camshafts in if you're going to be putting aftermarket camshafts in your car. I didn't degree mine, and if you're not going to degree yours, I do have some advice for you. Now listen closely on this one. If you buy them from Modular Head Shop, he can walk you through the steps on that to make sure your valves don't hit the piston. But if you buy the stage 1 comp cams that I just showed you, the first time I put my set in was on my old bottom end, and I thought, well, let me go ahead and set them. Remember I was just talking about the little bit of play that you have in here to play with to advance or retard your camshafts. I said, let me go ahead and start on the advanced side, because again, I didn't want to lose any bottom end torque, and I didn't know if I was going to lose any with these cams or not. So I started on the advanced side, and sure enough, the intake valve ever so slightly hit the piston right there. It was sounding like I had lifters tapping. Didn't hurt anything except for leaving a little mark on the piston, but that's what it did. I quickly drove the car back home, set them in the retarded side, the cams, with the little bit of play that I have in here. I set them in as retarded as I could get them, and that stopped, went away right away. So if you put stage 1 cams in, start on the retarded side. Don't advance them yet. Some of my issues might have been that I did already have the heads slightly milled, so the heads were already the valves are already a little bit closer to the piston. That could have been some of what, but if you go in the forums, other people have had that issue before too, so it's not unheard of. So my suggestion is set them both with the camshafts a little bit retarded and start there. And then what you should do, this is what I did. If you're not going to degree the cams in, next thing you want to do after you set them both retarded is do a compression test on your engine. With all the spark plugs out, disconnect the fuel injectors so that you're not shooting gas in there. Do a compression check on the left bank and then on the right bank. Check all the cylinders on the left, all the cylinders on the right. Pick the highest on the left and the highest on the right and compare the two. The side that has the highest compression between the left and the right bank, if the right bank has higher compression than the left bank, that means the valve timing or the cams are advanced on that side. The side that has the lower compression, the cams are retarded. So what you want to do is, after first you retard both the camshafts, you do that compression test and you figure out which side has higher. If they're both equal, you're good. But if you have one side that's higher, like let's say this side right here had higher compression than this. So what I'll do is I know that this one's not hitting the valves aren't hitting the piston, so I can advance this one to match this one. So what you want to do is you want to, with that little bit of play you got in there, you advance that camshaft until the compression matches that side, and then they might not be technically degreed, but they're at least even, and that's nice to know. So that's a good tip for you guys. The passenger side bank had about 10 psi more compression when I did the compression test than the driver's side bank. So I ended up advancing the driver's side bank with a little bit of play that allowed me to right in here. I advanced it actually all the way that it would allow me in here, and that actually got the compression equal. Motor runs great. And when you're swapping out them camshafts, remember that number 58 on the bottom cam gear down here. If you set the index mark, this mark right here, some of your cars will have this type of bottom gear that's a one piece, and some of your cars will have a two-piece one. Whichever one you have doesn't really matter, but there's the mark for the two-piece one, there's the mark for the one-piece one. Set that mark on the bottom like you see right here. Put it on the bottom side. You know, there's your crankshaft right there where your harmonic balancer bolts up. Set that mark on the bottom side, and then what you do is you count the pins on the chain. That's 1 pin, 2 pin. You count the pins on the chain, but the tight part of the chain, not the side that the tensioner's on, but the side that's doing the pulling on your cam gear, the tight side. It'll be right here on this for the passenger side of the motor. For the driver's side, it'll be this one right here. So you count the pins all the way up. So you see that mark on the gear right there? On that gear, it's this mark right here. And on this one, it's that one right here. So if you count the pins, I'm going to do it right here in front of you real quick to give you an idea. Let's do it like this. We start counting. This is the cam that's out up front. It'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's how we're going to count it. So let's give it a shot here. Give you an example. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46. I'm going to stop right here where that black mark's at. That's 46 because we got to change the picture here. Wrong way. Okay, we stopped right there. That was 46. Let me get my hand over here. So that would be 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. You see there's 58 pins between that mark and the mark and that mark on the bottom. When you have the crankshaft spun in a position where that's on the bottom, there'll be 58 pins. And on the tight end of the cam chain, and the same will be true for the other one right here. I'm not going to count that one because it goes behind this one, and we can't see it in the picture here. But it's the same thing. You kind of get underneath the car, stick your head underneath there, and start counting. You get 1, 2, 3, and you count all the way up this side, all the way up to where that dot's at right there, and there'll be 58 pins between here and here. So when your cam timing is right, you will have 58 pins between the mark right there and the mark right there, going down the tight sides of the chain down to there. So that's how you set your cam timing. At least that's how I do it. I'm mainly a motorcycle mechanic, and that's a technique we use a lot in the motorcycle world, and it works well for me. And while you're in there, if you have the plastic timing chain tensioners, you're going to want to replace them with the metal ones. Ford used some plastic ones through some years and some metal ones through the other years, but the metal ones are good because they have this ratchet right here, and these are really the ones you want when you're really running these things hard. Modular Head Shop sells them right here for $129 currently. That's what they suggest to use. You can also find them using eBay for a decent price, but if you're already in there, just go ahead and pull the plastic ones out and get some metal ones in there. By the time you get to this part of your build where you have all the stage 2 stuff covered and you're just stepping into stage 3, meaning you just put in stage 1 camshafts, your 19-pound injectors are going to be at their limit. It will run your camshafts. I've done it. My brother's done it. I did it even with long tube headers, but it was maxed out pretty much. They claim you shouldn't be using any more than 90% of your injector's capability. I believe I was using well over, probably close to 95%, maybe 98% when I had the stage 1 cams and the long tube headers in. So once you get the camshafts in, you might want to start considering upgrading to some 24-pound injectors. These were real common in a lot of the Ford cars. I know the Cobra came with the 24-pound injectors. You can find these good used ones that were rebuilt on eBay and stuff like that. They're pretty readily available. But at this point, you're going to want to get rid of these, put some of these 24s in, and that'll make sure that your back down to probably about 80 to 85% of the max duty on the injectors, and that way if you hit some really cool air on a really cool night and it needs the extra fuel, you're not going to push it to its limit and end up running too lean. So at this point is when you're going to want to start considering injectors. Now you can't just bolt on injectors and drive off. At that point you will need a tune somehow, some way. You can either get a hold of SCT or some other tuner. They can send you a can tune to make your injectors, your 24s work, or you can take it to a guy that runs a dyno and can tune your car for the 24-pound injectors. But at that point you're definitely going to want to start considering 24-pound injectors. But up to this point, your 19-pound injectors will be just fine. So there's no reason to rush out in the 24 until you get to about this level. And in most cases, if you already have a good tune on your car, either a can tune or a dyno tune from previous, but they already have the timing advancement set and everything's all dialed in, you can just throw these camshafts in. You don't have to go get another tune. Your car's going to run just fine. I have read in the forums that there's a handful of people that put these camshafts in, or stage 1 camshafts in, and they were having idling problems. But it's kind of rare, and I'm kind of suspicious that they didn't already have problems already, like their fuel trims are already in the double digits or something like that. The car was, remember I was mentioning you want to keep track of your fuel trims and try to keep them in the single digits. And I have a feeling that they already had some stuff that was pretty far out of whack when they threw these camshafts in. There was no room to grow any, so it just caused issues. But if you can keep track of your fuel trims and everything's pretty good, and for the most part it's in the single digits, you should, at idle and at part throttle, you should be able to just pop these camshafts in and plug and play and just go. The tune that I had before I put my camshafts in was just a tune for a full bolt-on, a stage 2 setup with PI heads, PI cams, and everything like that. Stage 2 setup, and I went in. I already did a G-Tech run, so I knew what kind of horsepower I was pushing. I went in, had a full dyno tune. They cranked in a little bit more time in, corrected the air-fuel ratio a little bit, and honestly, I probably only gained about 3 horsepower on the dyno tune over the previous tune that was set up for the PI setup. So don't think that when you put the camshafts in, and you already had a tune, if you go out and get another tune, you're going to find a magical 20-30 horsepower. That's not the case. You'll only find maybe a couple if you're lucky, but it doesn't hurt if you got the money to go get another tune. But the point I'm getting at is you don't necessarily need a tune just because you threw on the the stage 1 camshafts, and your car should run good right out the gate. And the next thing that I would do after adding some good stage 1 cams would be long tube headers. I gotta admit, this is probably my favorite modification out of all the modifications that I've done to this car. I don't know, maybe it's the sound, something about long tube headers, they just sound great. They give the car a deeper note. You will get more under hood noise, especially at full throttle. You'll get this like sound underneath the hood, and it makes your car sound like a race car when you get on the throttle. They're really cool, and it's a good bump in power. Remember I mentioned that you can gain about 30, maybe 35 out of camshafts. You're gonna gain 10, I would say 9 to 14 rear wheel horsepower with some long tube headers. Now these are Mac right here. They don't sell Mac anymore, but BBK makes a pretty decent long tube header for the price. My brother ended up with some BBK on his car because Mac went out of business. I have Mac on my car. Keep in mind when you buy long tube headers, you will also need the H pipe or X pipe for the system, so you're gonna have to buy that as well. And there's all kinds of instructions on the internet and the forums and stuff like that. You could just Google it and how to install them. But I can tell you from experience, if the motor's already in the car, the best way to install it is to drop the K member. The K member is the frame underneath your motor that holds your motor and your front wheels on and everything. You'll want to drop that. It's not a big deal. Me and my brother did it in his driveway, and one day we dropped the K member, bolted on the BBK long tube headers, put the K member back in. If you're going to drop the K member, it's best to mark its position and where it's at, because if you loosen the bolts up, the K member has a little bit of wiggle there, and that's going to change your front wheels. That little bit of wiggle is going to change your front wheels where they're at. So do a real good job marking exactly where your K member is positioned at on your frame. So when you drop it and you put it back in and you bolt it up, you can set it right back in the same place so you don't knock your alignment off between the front and the rear wheels. But if you do knock the alignment off between your front and rear wheels, or the K member alignment as it's called, you can Google it. There's actually some websites that sell aftermarket K members, and they tell you how to square up your K member, as it's called, where you measure from the front right tire to the rear left, and the front left to the rear right, and then straight from the two left to two right. It's a whole thing of instructions, but you measure that out, and then you can pretty much figure out which way you need to slide your K member to get all four of your wheels squared out. Them instructions are pretty readily available on the internet, and there's more than one way to skin a cat. Some people have easier methods to do it, some people have harder methods, but you can Google it, find it. It's not hard to do. I've done it on mine. But long tube headers, they do good with the camshafts. They sound good. I like mine, so I definitely highly suggest them after you get the stage 1 cams. And lastly, the cylinder heads. These are just some stock heads right here that I pulled the valves out. I was going to try porting them myself, but then I decided to buy some CNC ported heads from Modular Head Shop. I ended up going with their stage 2 heads. They suggested the stage 2, which the price has gone up a little bit since then. They're about $3,000 now. When I bought them, they were about $2,000. But anyway, that's inflation. You know who to thank for that one. But yeah, so I ended up with the stage 2 heads. He suggested it when I made the phone call to him because of the camshafts I had in it and the long tube headers. He was like, you're going to want the stage 2. It'll come with a 1mm bigger stainless steel valves. Both the exhaust and intake are 1mm bigger, as well as some stronger valve springs. And that's where things get tricky. I expected a big bang in performance when I went to the ported heads. I really did. You know, at the time I was producing 314 at the rear wheels. That was with the long tube headers and the stage 1 camshafts on a dyno. There's my dyno sheet right there. I was producing, where is it? Yeah, 314 right there at the rear wheels and 223 torque. That was with the long tube headers and the stage 1 cams. I thought I would bolt these up and gain like 30 horsepower or something like that, but that wasn't the case. It only got me a 330 max horsepower, and that's in cool air. If it's a hot, humid summer day, my horsepower can drop down. You know, again, I'm using the G-Tech for these numbers, but on the street, my horsepower can drop down to about 314. But on a cool, crisp night, I get 330 rear wheel horsepower and 345 foot-pounds of torque, and it just never goes higher than 330. No matter how much better the weather gets, it tops out at 330. Most of my runs are somewhere in the 320 range, and but the highest it goes is 330, and it just caps out. And here's why. At that point, the intake manifold is the bottleneck. This guy right here, he worked for Modular Head Shop. I believe he's one of the guys that started the company. He has since passed away, unfortunately. And but he used to share a wealth of knowledge in the forums. All you got to do is search for his name if you want to collect a wealth of knowledge. But one of the things that I gathered from him is this intake manifold caps out at 330 horsepower, rear wheel horsepower. I found it to be right. He has that down to a science, because I can't get over 330 horsepower. But he highly suggests this intake if you're driving on the street. Even though with the stage 1 cams, my ported heads, man, my long tube headers, if I change this intake manifold out, I can probably get this car up to around 350 rear wheel horsepower, 340, 350. If I put on one of your aftermarket intake manifolds, like an Elderbrock or a Trick Flow intake manifold here, I could probably get it up to 350 horsepower with one of them intake manifolds on my current setup. And then if I threw on some stage 2 camshafts or stage 3, man, I can get this thing probably up to 360, maybe even 370 rear wheel horsepower. But here's the thing, once you start doing that, you're going to suffer losing drivability, bottom end response, and just the fun of the car is going to go. Yes, it will be faster down the quarter mile. You're going to be able to brag about that. So So maybe you broke 11 seconds going down the quarter mile, but the car's not going to be as fun to drive around on a day-to-day basis. It's going to lose that, and I didn't want to lose that, so I decided to take his advice and stick with the stock intake manifold for the best drivability, the best torque, and it makes great power. It just signs off early. It doesn't allow the motor to reach extreme high revs where it's going to make really good peak horsepower once you have some bigger camshafts, long tube headers, and ported heads. So with this intake manifold, don't expect to take it much higher than 6,700 RPMs. That's where mine's set at right now. It hits the rev limiter there, and that's about all you can expect out of it, but it's going to do great all the way up to there, and it's going to cap your horsepower at 330. So was the ported heads a waste of money or time, knowing that, well, I'm still capped at 330? It only brought me from 314 to 340. I'm going to kind of say it depends. Let me explain. Even though at peak horsepower at 5,800 RPMs, the ported heads brought me from about 314 horsepower to 330, both in good air. That's what the ported heads got me up to, is about 330 at 5,500 RPMs. However, what the ported heads definitely did was increase the horsepower. Hey, quiet. Even more than that outside of that range. So at 5,000 RPMs, I actually increased my horsepower by 20 with going to the ported heads at 5,000 RPMs. And at 6,300 RPMs, I gained about 12.5 horsepower. So even though it only gained about 14 at my peak my peak RPMs of 5,800, it gained 20 horsepower technically at 5,000 RPMs, and it gained 12.5 horsepower at 6,300 RPMs, meaning it broadened the peak power and overall made the car faster. So even though it didn't get me over the restriction of this, it got me close to that for a broad range, which makes the car quicker overall. But still, honestly, the car ran damn good with the stock heads. Yes, it only made 314 at the rear wheels, which is actually good for a 2-valve. And I did gain 20 horsepower at 5,000 RPMs, which is good when I went to the ported heads. But at $3,000 for a set, plus the amount of labor it takes to bolt them on, I would say go ahead and skip that. Just get the camshafts and the long tube headers, and skip that until you need some heads, or if you're going to pull the motor out for whatever reason, then maybe consider it. Otherwise, unless you got the money to spend and some spare time, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of money for 20 horsepower at 5,000 RPMs and about 16 horsepower at peak. So the car runs. Trust my brother, that's the only thing that he didn't do over mine, besides I have the higher compression with the PI heads and the NPI bottom end, but I also had the ported heads, and otherwise identical builds. His car ran damn good. So these aren't necessary. These ported heads aren't necessary unless you need heads. I did need some new heads. I started having some tapping sounds. I believe it was probably just a loose valve guide or whatever, and the heads had a lot of miles on them. I was like, well, I'm going to need a set of heads. So I went ahead and bought me some CNC ported heads, and they've been good. By the way, I totally recommend Modular Head Shop. Very good service. Heck, they even mailed me a t-shirt with the heads. But if you do get ported heads, I have one good solid tip for you, and this is something that I learned. When I first bolted the heads on, I actually lost bottom end response and torque. So anywhere under 2,500 RPMs, there was a drop in torque, and I wasn't really happy about that. That was why I went and changed the gearing from 355 to 373 to try to regain some of that torque back. And even then, I could still feel it was a little bit soggy down there, and I was like, bummer, man. I did not want to lose that bottom end torque, but I found a way to get it back. When they port your heads, they're going to make the intake port a little bit bigger. That's what they do when they port them. And even this area right here, and that's where your fuel injector is at. On the intake manifold, where your fuel injector goes into these holes right here, if we flip the intake manifold around, here you go. When you flip the intake manifold upside down here, the injectors will be sitting right here, and they squirt their fuel right into that area right here. Now this intake manifold right here has already been modified, so I'm showing you one that's already been, I guess you say, ported, but there's a big ridge in stock form. This ridge right here is real fat, and it extends all the way to about here, all the way around. It literally sticks out. And then there's a sharp spot to the hump down here. What I did is I smoothed out the sharp spot to the hump. You don't want to eat away too much of this right here, but then you just make a smooth, you just keep a straight line going all the way up, this thing right here to where you make this piece right here pointy. And you do that on every one of these ports, and that's all you do. I did that. Not only does it give you a bigger port opening, but it brings the air intake velocity as it's coming through this port. It allows it to get closer to the fuel injector here and pull the fuel faster and with more force into the intake valve. And just by doing that, not only did I feel like I gained some power, but clearly got all my torque back. Like, it was right in my face. I ran into the same guy, the Nick guy, in a forum when they asked about port and intake manifolds. He said there's not a whole lot you can do with these, but he did suggest that you could do this right here. And I only tried that after I had the ported heads. I said, well, let me give it a shot on this old intake right here. This intake's in bad shape, but I gave it a shot. Didn't want to run a good one, and it did the trick. So then I did the same thing to my good one and got all my torque back. So keep that in mind. You're going to want to do that. If you use ported heads, you're going to want to sharpen that up. Let me show you some pictures. This is not a PI intake. This is some other intake, but I'm using this as an example, and this is also aluminum. You can see how fat that is right there, and you can see how it's like got a ramp right there. It just ramps up, and it protrudes right into your intake charge. So that's why you want to get rid of that ramp and just make it a straight line smooth, because the charge is coming this way out right at us. So you want it, that ramp, it would literally have a ramp right here, as you can see. If I get the camera up in there close enough, right there. And here's a PI intake. You can see that the wall going around the injector is about the same thickness, but then once you do this mod, you'll see all you're doing is you're thinning it out right here and get rid of that wall. And that did the trick for me. Brought all my torque back. So keep that in mind. There's not a whole lot of porting you can do with these intakes, except for sharpening that up, smoothing out the hump ridge up in here. Maybe take a mild porting tool and just give this whole edge right here a little bit of a rounded cut. You see how I did right here, because they do have some hangover, some plastic flash hangover. You can feel it with your finger. As long as it's nice and smooth, you're good. But if anywhere you feel any hangover spot or whatever, go ahead and smoothen that out. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, you'll find some casting flaws up in here that you can smoothen out. And then whatever you have to do right here to make sure your plenum has a nice direct straight flow without any hangover spots. And that's the best you can do for these intake manifolds, and that's good enough. Well, I think that's pretty much a wrap. Just check down in the description. If I have any updates to this video down the road, I will put a link down in the description to an update, anything I might run into from this point on that I think you guys could benefit from. Also, there'll be many links in the description on things like the torque app, my brother's video on the 2 valves, and all the links that I talked about through this whole video will be in the description. She's been a good car. I've had her since 2010. I enjoy her. But I'm about to start looking for a 2013 or 2014 Mustang GT with the 5.0 liter. I'm getting that because it has a solid rear axle. It's a little bit lighter. I like them lightweight. They're funner. Do me a favor. If you made it to the end of this video, please, down in the comment section, write, I made it. Just so I'm just curious of who actually watched this whole video. And for you guys that did make it all the way to the end and watch this whole thing, I wish you guys the best of the luck with your Mustang build. If you have any questions, just go ahead and shoot them in the comment section. I'll answer them when I have time. I wish you guys the best of the luck. Enjoy your ride. keep it safe, keep it on the road. By the way, if you're curious of how my brother crashed his Mustang, he was driving through Tampa early morning, dark, accelerating out of a red light, hit like second or third gear, just torquing along, got to about 35 miles per hour, and all of a sudden the whole car, the back end just slid off to the side, and the whole car went off the road and pretty much hit a wall and destroyed the car, or totaled the car. It was not his fault. He walked back up the road and saw there was oil on the road from a crash that happened earlier that night. Of course, he called the city of Tampa, had them come out, got a police report on it and stuff like that. But because there was no bodily injury, he really can't find an attorney to pick up his case. So, car's totaled. He went and picked himself up a 2014 Mustang GT. But that's what happened to that car, unfortunately, and that's a bummer. And one more reminder, use a stock OEM Ford PI intake manifold, not the aftermarket Dorman intake manifold. The Dorman one, you will suffer some horsepower loss. But as for me, I'm hoping to keep this one around for many years. I have a lot of blood, sweat, and tears invested in this one. A lot of time just sorting a lot of little things out. So I will be picking me up a newer Mustang, but I'll keep this thing around just in my collection. I mean, shoot, at the time of making this video, she's 27 years old. I can't even drive her anywhere without people giving me compliments on her. And this is the original paint job on this thing, the original paint job. And I still get compliments for it everywhere I go. So, cool car. It would be hard to let go, and I probably wouldn't want to let it go. So I'm going to keep it around. Appreciate every single one of you guys. Enjoy the credits at the end of this video. Catch you guys next time.